good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Hey guys! Tonight we're drifting back to a time when life was shaped by that spring and the rocky slopes around it. Imagine a narrow ridge of land between deep valleys with a reliable spring bubbling at its foot. People have lived there for thousands of years, long before anyone called the place Jerusalem. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere special, drop your location and the local time in the comments. It always makes these quiet evenings feel a little more connected. Now, settle in, and let's begin. The first clear traces of human activity on this ridge appeared during the late Chalcolithic period and the early Bronze Age, roughly 3500 BCE, or even a bit earlier. Small groups of people settled on the southeastern hill, the one later known as the City of David. They built simple houses of stone and mud brick, and they depended on the Gihon spring for water. The spring flowed steadily from a cave, giving them a dependable supply even when rains failed elsewhere. Archaeologists have found pieces of pottery, stone tools, and the remains of early walls that once protected the settlement from the slopes below. Life moved at the pace of the seasons. Families grew barley and wheat on terraced plots, kept goats and sheep, and gathered whatever wild plants the hills offered. Trade was modest, perhaps some copper items or shells from distant shores, but the community stayed small. The name that appears in the earliest records is something like Urusalim, a Western Semitic word that probably meant foundation of Shalem, referring to a local god. Egyptian texts from around 1900 to 1800 BCE mention the city and its rulers, and letters from the 14th century BCE, found at Tel El Amarna, show a local king named Abdi Keba complaining about threats from wandering groups called the Hapiru. By the time the Israelites began to settle in the region, the city was held by a people known as the Jebusites. It sat on the border between the tribes of Benjamin and Judah, a natural stronghold because of its steep valleys on three sides. The Jebusites had improved the defences with a massive wall above the Gihon spring, and a system of tunnels and shafts that let them draw water safely, even during a siege. For a long while the city remained independent, a small Canaanite stronghold that watched the surrounding countryside. Then, around 1000 BCE, a new chapter opened. A leader named David, who had once been a shepherd and later a warrior in the service of the Israelite king Saul, turned his attention to this place. After Saul's death and years of conflict, David became king over the southern tribe of Judah and then over the northern tribes as well. He needed a capital that belonged to neither group completely, a neutral site that could unite the people. Jerusalem, still in Jebusite hands, fit that need perfectly. According to the accounts that have come down to us, David's men found a way into the city through the water system. The Jebusites had boasted that even the blind and the lame could defend the place, but David's forces took it. Once in control, he made Jerusalem the capital of the United Kingdom of Israel and Judah. He brought the sacred Ark of the Covenant there, giving the city both political and religious importance. David repaired the walls, built a palace, and began to organize the administration of his realm from this central hilltop. The population grew. Families from different tribes moved in, and the city slowly spread across the ridge. Craftsmen worked stone and metal, farmers brought produce to market, and officials kept records of taxes and labour. David ruled for about 40 years, and toward the end of his life he made plans for a temple to house the ark permanently. He bought a threshing floor on the higher ground to the north from a man named Araunah the Jebusite, but he left the actual building to his son. When David died, his son Solomon inherited a kingdom that stretched from the Euphrates River in the north to the border of Egypt in the south. Solomon brought a long period of peace and trade. He strengthened ties with neighbouring rulers, most famously with the Queen of Sheba, who travelled to Jerusalem with camels loaded with spices, gold, and precious stones. In return, Solomon sent cedar wood from Lebanon and other goods. The city benefited from this commerce. New buildings rose, and the royal court grew more elaborate. Solomon's greatest project was the temple on the hill that David had chosen. Construction took 7 years and involved thousands of workers. Stone was quarried nearby, timber floated down from the north, and skilled craftsmen from Tyre helped with the bronze work and fine details. When it was finished, the temple stood as a rectangular structure with an inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, where the Ark was placed. Outside were courtyards, altars, and storerooms. The dedication ceremony drew crowds from across the kingdom, and for the first time the people had a fixed central place for their worship. Beside the temple, Solomon built his own palace and administrative buildings. The city now covered more ground, and its walls enclosed a larger area. Life inside those walls followed a steady rhythm. Farmers left early for their fields, merchants set up stalls in open spaces, and priests carried out daily rituals at the temple. Water still came mainly from the Gihon spring, carried up through channels and stored in cisterns. Solomon's reign brought prosperity, but it also required heavy taxes and forced labour. When he died around 930 BCE, the northern tribes refused to accept his son, Rehoboam, as king on the same terms. The United Kingdom split. The northern part became the Kingdom of Israel, with its own capital first at Shechem and later at Samaria. The southern part, called Judah, kept Jerusalem as its centre. From that moment on, the story of the city belonged mainly to the smaller southern kingdom, though it would face constant pressure from larger powers nearby. For the next 2 centuries, Judah's kings ruled from Jerusalem. Some strengthened the defences and the temple, while others allowed practices that later writers condemned as unfaithful to the traditions David and Solomon had established. The city remained the religious heart of Judah, where people came for festivals and where the priests and prophets spoke. Yet it was never completely safe. Egyptian pharaoh Sheshonq I raided the area around 930 BCE, and later invasions by Philistines and Arabians brought more trouble. In 786 BCE, even the king of Israel, Joash, attacked and looted Jerusalem. One of the stronger rulers was Hezekiah, who came to the throne in the late 8th century BCE. He faced the growing power of Assyria, whose armies had already destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE and carried many of its people away. Hezekiah prepared Jerusalem for the coming storm. He repaired the walls, strengthened the gates, and most importantly, he ordered a tunnel cut through the rock from the Gihon spring to a pool inside the city. The Siloam Tunnel, as it is still called, brought water safely within the walls so that defenders would not suffer thirst during a siege. An inscription found inside the tunnel describes how 2 teams of workers met in the middle after digging from opposite ends. When the Assyrian king Sennacherib invaded Judah in 701 BCE, he captured many towns but failed to take Jerusalem. Hezekiah paid a heavy tribute, and the Assyrian records boast of shutting the king up like a bird in a cage, yet the city itself held. That survival became part of the city's memory, a sign that its god protected the place where the temple stood. Assyrian power eventually weakened, and a new empire rose in the East Babylon. In 612 BCE, the Babylonians destroyed the Assyrian capital Nineveh. A few years later, they turned their attention to Judah. King Jehoiakim of Judah rebelled, and in 597 BCE, the Babylonian king Nebuchadrezzar II captured Jerusalem, took treasures from the temple, and carried off the young king Jehoiachin, along with thousands of leading citizens. A decade later, in 587 or 586 BCE, the final blow fell. After another rebellion, Nebuchadrezzar's army surrounded the city again. The siege lasted many months. Food ran out, disease spread, and the walls were finally breached. The temple was burned, the palace destroyed, and the city left in ruins. Many of the remaining people of Judah were marched off to Babylon, beginning what became known as the exile. A small number stayed behind, trying to farm the damaged land, but Jerusalem was no longer a functioning capital. the ridge that had seen early Bronze Age settlers, Jebusite defenders, David's conquest. Solomon's temple and Hezekiah's tunnel now stood largely empty, its stones blackened and its houses collapsed. Yet the memory of the city and its temple did not disappear. In the villages of exile by the rivers of Babylon, people remembered Jerusalem and hoped one day to return. King David's conquest and the United Kingdom. After the long centuries when the ridge served as a modest Canaanite stronghold, a decisive change arrived with the rise of David. The shepherd who had become a successful military leader and then king over the tribe of Judah now looked for a capital that could bind the northern and southern tribes together without favouring either. Jerusalem, still held by the Jebusites and sitting on the border, offered exactly that position. David gathered his experienced fighters and approached the city. The Jebusites felt secure behind their walls and the steep valleys, even taunting that the blind and lame could hold the place against him. David's men discovered the water shaft that rose from the Gihon spring inside the fortifications. Using that hidden route, they entered the city and took control. Once inside, David made Jerusalem his capital and renamed the stronghold the City of David. He repaired the existing walls and began to organize the government of the newly united kingdom from this central location. One of his first important acts was to bring the Ark of the Covenant to the city. The Ark, a wooden chest covered with gold that held the tablets of the law, had travelled with the Israelites for generations. David arranged for it to be carried in procession with music and celebration. When the bearers stumbled and a man named Uzzah reached out to steady it, he was struck down, according to the accounts. David paused the procession, left the ark at the house of a man named Obed-Edom for 3 months, and only then completed the journey. The ark's arrival gave Jerusalem a new religious standing alongside its political role. David placed it in a tent he had prepared, planning for a permanent temple later. With the city now under his rule, David turned to building. He constructed a palace using cedar wood sent by the king of Tyre, Hiram, who became a useful ally. Craftsmen and labourers from different parts of the kingdom worked on the project. The population began to increase as families from Judah and the northern tribes moved in. Markets appeared in open areas, and officials recorded taxes in kind grain, oil and livestock that supported the court and the army. David also organised the military into units that could defend the borders and keep order inside the kingdom. During these years, the kingdom expanded. David's forces defeated the Philistines in several battles, pushing them back to the coastal plain. He subdued Moab, Edom and Ammon to the east and south, and he formed alliances with the Arameans in the north. Tribute flowed into Jerusalem, along with captives and goods that enriched the city. Yet David's reign was not only about conquest. He is remembered for composing songs and prayers that later became part of the collection known as the Psalms. These reflected both victories and personal troubles, including conflicts within his own family. Toward the end of his life, David faced a rebellion, led by his son Absalom, who tried to seize the throne. The fighting reached the forests east of the Jordan, where Absalom was killed. David mourned deeply, but the kingdom held together. Another son, Adonijah, made a late attempt to claim power, but David's supporters quickly backed Solomon instead. On his deathbed, David instructed Solomon to complete the temple he had planned. He had already gathered materials and chosen the site on the higher ground north of the city of David, the place where he had bought the threshing floor years earlier. When David died after ruling about 40 years, Solomon inherited a kingdom that stretched from the Euphrates in the north to the border with Egypt in the south. The United Kingdom was at its largest extent. Solomon did not need to fight many wars. Instead, he focused on trade and building. He strengthened the alliance with Hiram of Tyre, sending workers to the Lebanon mountains to cut cedar and cypress trees. These logs were floated down the coast and then carried overland to Jerusalem. Solomon also built a fleet of ships at the Gulf of Aqaba, with help from Phoenician sailors. The ships sailed to distant ports and returned with gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. Trade routes brought wealth into the capital. Merchants from Arabia arrived with spices and frankincense. Egyptian and Hittite goods appeared in the markets. Solomon used some of this income to enlarge the city. He strengthened the walls that David had repaired and added new gates. The royal court grew more formal, with officials managing different departments, tax collection, labour crews, and foreign affairs. 12 officers oversaw the supply of food for the palace, each responsible for 1 month of the year. The daily provisions included large amounts of flour, grain, cattle, sheep, and deer. Solomon also developed copper mining and refining in the south, near the Gulf of Aqaba. Smelting furnaces there produced metal for tools, weapons, and temple fittings. Horses and chariots were imported and stabled in cities built for that purpose. Jerusalem itself saw new construction beyond the palace. Administrative buildings rose, and the population continued to grow. People from the countryside brought produce to sell, while artisans worked in small workshops making pottery, textiles, and metal items. The most important project remained the temple. Solomon began the work in the 4th year of his reign and finished it in 7 years. The structure stood on the prepared platform. Its main hall measured about 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Inside, cedar panels carved with flowers, palms, and cherubim covered the walls. The inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, was a perfect cube lined with gold. 2 large cherubim of olive wood overlaid with gold spread their wings over the ark. Outside, a great bronze altar and a huge basin called the Sea of Bronze stood in the courtyard. The dedication ceremony filled the city with people from across the kingdom. Priests carried the ark into its new home while music and sacrifices filled the air. After the temple, Solomon built his own palace complex, which took 13 years. It included the house of the Forest of Lebanon for storage, a hall for judgment, and living quarters. He also constructed a palace for his Egyptian wife, the daughter of a pharaoh. These buildings used the same fine materials as the temple stone foundations, cedar beams, and costly decorations. The city now felt more like a royal capital than the modest stronghold David had captured. Throughout the kingdom, Solomon divided the land into 12 districts for administration and taxation. Labour crews worked on building projects in many places, including the cities of Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer, where strong gates and walls followed similar designs. Jerusalem remained the centre, where decisions were made and where the temple drew worshippers for the 3 main festivals each year: Passover, Weeks, and Tabernacles. During those times the streets filled with pilgrims, animals for sacrifice, and merchants selling food and goods. Yet the prosperity came at a cost. The heavy taxes and forced labour created resentment, especially in the north. When Solomon died around 930 BCE, the northern tribes refused to accept his son Rehoboam unless the burdens were lightened. Rehoboam's harsh reply, "My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions," led to the split. The northern tribes formed their own kingdom of Israel under Jeroboam, while the south, Judah, kept Jerusalem and the line of David. From that point, the united kingdom that David had built and Solomon had enlarged existed only in memory. Jerusalem remained the capital of the smaller southern realm, still centered on the temple and the palace. The city's walls continued to protect its people, and its springs still supplied water, but the larger realm David had ruled was gone. The story of the city now moved forward under the kings of Judah alone, facing new pressures from neighbouring powers while holding on to the traditions established in those earlier decades. Solomon's reign and the first temple with the capital now firmly established, the focus shifted to the great structure that would serve as the religious centre for the entire kingdom. Solomon directed the final stages of preparation on the higher ground north of the original settlement. Teams of workers from across the realm and skilled artisans from the coast completed the interior fittings under the supervision of specialists sent by the king of Tyre. The main hall received walls lined from floor to ceiling with imported wood, every surface carved with patterns of flowers and winged figures before being covered in a layer of pure gold. The innermost chamber was set apart by doors of olive wood. also overlaid in gold, creating a space reserved for the most sacred object in the nation's possession. When everything stood ready, Solomon called the leaders and elders from every part of the land to participate in the dedication. The priests carried the ark in solemn procession while singers and musicians played on harps, lyres and cymbals. As the ark was placed in its new resting spot, a thick cloud filled the entire building so completely that the priests could no longer perform their duties. Solomon then stood before the altar and spoke a long prayer that acknowledged the limits of any human building. He asked that this house serve as a place where prayers could be heard, whether offered by his own people in times of drought or defeat, or even by foreigners drawn by the city's reputation. The ceremony stretched over many days, with so many animals offered on the altar that the priests struggled to manage the constant flow of sacrifices. Fire from heaven was said to have consumed the offerings on the first day, and the people responded with shouts of joy and prolonged feasting. The temple quickly became more than a building. It drew the religious focus of the whole kingdom to this single location. Previously, people had offered sacrifices at various local sites throughout the countryside, but now the main rituals and festivals required travel to Jerusalem. Families planned their journeys months in advance, bringing first fruits, animals for the altar, and tithes that supported the priests and Levites who served in rotating groups. The Levites maintained the music that accompanied every service, while the priests handled the daily morning and evening offerings. This centralization gave the city a rhythm tied to the calendar of 3 great festivals each year. When the streets filled with travelers from distant villages carrying bundles of produce and leading flocks along the roads that climbed the surrounding hills, Solomon's reputation for insight into difficult matters also grew. During these years, one well-remembered case involved 2 women who lived in the same house and both claimed motherhood of the same infant. After listening to their arguments, Solomon ordered a sword brought forward and suggested the child be divided in 2. The true mother immediately begged that the baby be given to the other woman rather than harmed, while the false claimant agreed to the division. The king's decision spread through the markets and caravans, reinforcing the idea that wisdom resided in the royal court at Jerusalem. Visitors arrived regularly to test him with riddles and observe how the administration functioned. Among the most notable was the queen of a southern kingdom who travelled with a long train of camels loaded with spices, gold, and rare stones. She questioned Solomon on every subject that came to mind, and examined the order of his household, the clothing of his servants, and the way the temple rituals were conducted. Her final comment was that the reports she had heard had not told even half the story, and she left behind gifts that added further to the city's stores of wealth. Trade routes that had begun to open under David now carried goods in greater volume. Ships built with help from Phoenician sailors sailed from the head of the Gulf in the south and returned with loads of exotic materials. Overland caravans brought frankincense and myrrh from Arabia, while merchants from the north exchanged timber and fine cloth. The income supported not only the court but also the maintenance of the temple and the growing number of people who made their living in its service. Scribes kept careful records of incoming goods and the assignment of labour crews. 12 officers, each responsible for 1 month, ensured that the palace and temple received regular supplies of grain, oil, cattle, and other provisions. This system kept the daily operations running smoothly and gave many families a steady connection to the capital. The priests and their families formed a distinct group within the city, living in quarters near the temple and receiving portions of the offerings as their support. Artisans who worked on repairs or produced vessels for the rituals occupied workshops along the lower slopes. Farmers from the surrounding valleys brought their best produce during harvest seasons and returned home with news of what they had seen in the courts and the sanctuary. Foreigners who settled for trade or marriage added new words and customs to the streets, though the temple remained the place where the traditional practices were observed most strictly. Music and song, many of them attributed to the earlier king, filled the courtyards on festival days, creating an atmosphere of shared purpose, even among people who had come from different regions. Solomon also strengthened ties with neighbouring rulers through marriage alliances. The daughter of an Egyptian pharaoh received her own residence, and other unions brought women from Moab, Ammon, and further afield. These connections helped keep the borders peaceful and opened additional avenues for commerce. yet they also introduced a wider variety of influences into the royal household. Some of the new arrivals maintained their own customs, and over time small shrines appeared in private quarters, though the public worship continued to centre on the temple. The king himself is remembered for collecting sayings and proverbs that offered practical guidance on daily conduct, many of which later circulated widely and shaped how people thought about justice, work, and family life. In the markets that sprang up near the gates, buyers and sellers bargained over goods that reflected the city's growing connections. Pottery from coastal workshops, metal tools forged in southern foundries, and woven fabrics dyed in bright colours from northern traders filled the stalls. Children played in the open spaces between houses, and older residents gathered in the evenings to talk about the latest caravan that had arrived or the upcoming festival. The spring at the base of the ridge continued to supply water, now carried in larger quantities to the temple area for the constant needs of purification rituals. Reservoirs cut into the rock stored rainwater for the dry months, ensuring that the city never lacked for this essential resource. As the rain continued, the scale of the court and the temple required careful management to prevent overburdening the population. Labour crews rotated through projects, and taxes were collected in measured portions so that no single district felt the full weight at once. The city's growth could be seen in the way new houses filled the spaces between the original walls and the temple platform. Pilgrims who returned home after a festival often spoke of the sense of unity they felt when standing in the courtyard and hearing the same songs sung by thousands of voices. The temple had become the heart of a shared identity, a place where the history of the people was remembered and their hopes for the future were expressed through prayer and sacrifice. Yet even in this time of achievement, the responsibilities of ruling a large territory demanded constant attention. Solomon maintained garrisons in strategic towns and kept the roads safe for merchants. His fleet and the overland routes brought steady revenue, but the need to support such activity meant that every part of the kingdom contributed. The priests developed detailed schedules for their service, ensuring that the rituals never ceased. Levites trained younger members in the musical traditions so that each generation could continue the work. Scholars and scribes copied records of laws and teachings, preserving the knowledge that guided both temple practice and everyday decisions. The atmosphere in Jerusalem during these decades reflected a balance between the grandeur of the royal projects and the ordinary routines of its inhabitants. Families rose early to tend gardens or workshops, then paused for the temple's morning offerings when the smoke from the altar rose visibly above the ridge. Merchants closed their stalls at dusk while the evening sacrifice was offered, and the sound of trumpets carried across the valleys. It was said that silver became so plentiful in the city that it was regarded as no more valuable than ordinary stones, and cedar wood appeared in such quantity that it rivaled the common sycamores of the lowlands, a quiet reminder of how far the reach of trade had extended under this ruler. The temple stood as the visible sign of the kingdom's rule, unity, and the place where its religious life found its clearest expression. People from every tribe felt they had a share in it, and the annual gatherings reinforced that connection. Solomon's careful organization of the priesthood and the support system for the Levites ensured that the services remained orderly and continuous. The dedication and the years that followed marked a high point in the city's early story, when the hilltop sanctuary drew the attention of the known world and gave the inhabitants a common focus that shaped their daily patterns and their sense of belonging. Division of the kingdom and growing threats after Solomon's death around 930 BCE, the fragile unity that had held the tribes together quickly unravelled. His son Rehoboam travelled north to Shechem, where representatives from the northern tribes gathered to confirm him as king. They asked for relief from the heavy taxes and labour demands that had supported the large building projects and court in Jerusalem. Rehoboam consulted first with the older advisers who had served his father, then with the younger men who had grown up alongside him. Following the harsher advice of the younger group, he told the assembly that he would increase the burden rather than lighten it. The northern tribes responded by declaring their independence and choosing Jeroboam, a former official who had fled to Egypt during Solomon's reign, as their ruler. From that moment the single kingdom split into two, the northern realm called Israel with its capital first at Shechem and later at Samaria, and the southern realm of Judah centered on Jerusalem. The division left Judah as the smaller and more vulnerable of the two states. It consisted mainly of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, along with some Levites who remained loyal to the temple and the house of David. Jerusalem kept the temple and the royal line, which gave it a unique religious claim that the northern kingdom could not match. Jeroboam quickly set up his own worship sites at Bethel and Dan, with golden calves to prevent his people from travelling south for the festivals. This move widened the religious gap between the two realms. In Jerusalem, the priests and Levites who had served in the temple continued their work, but now they served a much smaller territory and population. The kings who followed Rehoboam in Judah worked to strengthen the capital's defences and maintain the temple rituals. Some repaired sections of the walls and gates that had suffered from earlier raids. Others focused on removing objects associated with foreign worship that had found their way into the temple area. Life in the city settled into a quieter pattern than during Solomon's time. Farmers from the surrounding hills brought their harvests to the markets near the gates, exchanging grain, olives, and wine for tools, cloth, and salt. Artisans in small workshops produced everyday items, pottery jars for storing oil, bronze utensils, and woven garments. The spring at the base of the ridge continued to supply water, carried up in jars or through small channels to cisterns inside the walls. Families lived in houses built of stone foundations with mud brick upper stories, often sharing courtyards with neighbours. The two kingdoms sometimes fought each other, and sometimes formed temporary alliances against common enemies. In one notable clash, the king of Israel even entered Jerusalem, broke down part of the wall, and carried off treasures from the temple and palace. Yet the greater danger came from larger powers beyond their borders. Egypt under Pharaoh Shishak had already raided the region shortly after the split, taking valuables from Jerusalem. Further north, the rising power of Assyria began to cast a long shadow. Assyrian kings conducted annual campaigns to collect tribute and expand their territory, gradually moving closer to the small states of the Levant. In Judah, King Asa and later his son Jehoshaphat tried to keep the peace and strengthen their position. Jehoshaphat appointed judges in the cities and in Jerusalem to handle disputes according to established laws. He also sent officials and Levites throughout the countryside to teach the people the traditions preserved in the temple. During his reign, a coalition of Moabites, Ammonites, and others threatened the southern borders, but the army of Judah met them without a direct battle after the invaders turned on one another. The temple remained the focal point of national life, with priests maintaining the daily sacrifices and the people gathering for the major festivals when travel was safe. As the 9th and 8th centuries BCE progressed, the northern kingdom of Israel grew more prosperous through trade, but also more unstable politically. A series of short-lived dynasties and assassinations weakened it. Judah, though smaller, enjoyed longer periods of stability under the Davidic line. King Uzziah, who ruled for over 50 years, strengthened Jerusalem's fortifications, improved the organization of the army, and developed farming and herding in the south. His son Jotham continued this work, adding to the walls and building towers in the countryside. Yet the external pressure kept increasing. The Assyrian Empire under kings like Tiglath-Pileser III began to demand tribute from the small states and to deport populations from conquered areas as a way of preventing future revolts. When Tiglath-Pileser marched into the region, the northern kingdom lost territory, and many of its people were carried away. The king of Israel at the time, Pekah, formed an alliance with the king of Aram Damascus and tried to force the king of Judah, Ahaz, to join them against Assyria. When Ahaz refused, the allies attacked Jerusalem. Ahaz sent a message to the Assyrian king, offering tribute and asking for help. Tiglath-Pileser responded by destroying Damascus and reducing Israel to a much smaller territory. Ahaz travelled to Damascus to meet the Assyrian ruler and saw an altar there that he liked. He sent a model back to Jerusalem and had the high priest build a similar one in the temple courtyard, moving the original bronze altar aside. This change marked a shift in the temple practices that later writers viewed with disapproval. Ahaz's son Hezekiah came to the throne around 715 BCE and immediately set about reversing many of his father's policies. He removed the foreign-style altar, destroyed objects associated with other gods, and reopened the temple for proper worship according to the older traditions. He also repaired the walls and strengthened the gates. Most importantly for the city's survival, Hezekiah ordered engineers to cut a tunnel through solid rock from the Gihon spring outside the walls to a new pool inside the city. The tunnel, about 1,750 feet long, brought water safely within the fortifications. Workers began from both ends and met in the middle, as recorded in an inscription carved on the wall near the meeting point. The inscription describes how the two teams heard each other's picks and finished the connection with only a small adjustment in direction. Hezekiah also prepared for the inevitable Assyrian response. The Assyrian king Sennacherib had already destroyed the northern kingdom in 722 BCE, deporting many of its inhabitants and resettling foreigners in their place. In 701 BCE, Sennacherib turned his attention to Judah. His army captured 46 fortified towns and besieged Jerusalem. Hezekiah paid a large tribute of gold and silver, stripping even the gold from the temple doors to meet the demand. The Assyrian records boast of shutting Hezekiah up in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage, yet the city itself did not fall. According to the accounts, a sudden disaster struck the Assyrian camp during the night, and Sennacherib withdrew without taking the capital. The people of Jerusalem saw this as a sign that the temple and the city remained under special protection. Hezekiah's preparations and the survival of the city gave the inhabitants a renewed sense of security for a time. The tunnel continued to supply water, and the repaired walls stood firm. Farmers returned to their fields, and the temple resumed its regular rhythm of sacrifices and festivals. The priests and Levites maintained their duties, and scribes copied and studied the older writings that recorded the nation's laws and history. Yet the Assyrian Empire remained the dominant power, and future kings would have to navigate carefully between paying tribute and preserving independence. The next ruler, Manasseh, took a different approach. He reversed many of Hezekiah's religious reforms, allowing altars to other gods inside the temple courts and even placing a carved image there. His long reign brought a measure of quiet because he cooperated with Assyria, but later writers remembered it as a time when the city drifted far from its earlier standards. Manasseh's grandson Josiah came to the throne as a boy, and when he reached adulthood, began a thorough reform. Workers repairing the temple discovered a scroll containing the Book of the Law. When it was read to the king, he tore his clothes in distress and ordered a nationwide effort to remove all foreign worship sites and to centralize sacrifices once again in Jerusalem. Josiah gathered the people in the temple courtyard and read the scroll. Aloud, he renewed the covenant and led the nation in a great Passover celebration that had not been observed in the same way for many generations. The festival drew large crowds to the city, filling the streets and the temple area with families sharing meals of roasted lamb and unleavened bread. For a few years, Jerusalem experienced a revival of the older practices. Josiah also extended his control northward into former Israelite territory, removing altars and bringing some of the northern priests to the capital. Yet this period of reform ended abruptly when Josiah marched out to meet the Egyptian army at Megiddo and was killed in battle. His death in 609 BCE left Judah without a strong leader at a dangerous moment. The Babylonian Empire was now rising in the east after destroying the Assyrian capital Nineveh in 612 BCE. Judah found itself caught between Egypt and Babylon. The next kings tried to play one power against the other, but the policy brought disaster. In 597 BCE, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II captured Jerusalem after a short siege, took treasures from the temple, and carried off the young king Jehoiachin along with thousands of the leading citizens, soldiers, and craftsmen. He placed a new king, Zedekiah, on the throne as a vassal. For several years Zedekiah paid tribute, but then he rebelled, hoping for help from Egypt. Nebuchadrezzar returned with a larger army, surrounded the city, and began a siege that lasted about 18 months. During the long months of the siege, food supplies ran low, disease spread, and the people inside the walls grew desperate. The Babylonian forces built siege ramps and pounded the walls with battering rams. In the summer of 586 BCE, they finally broke through. Zedekiah and his soldiers tried to escape at night, but were captured on the plains east of the city. The Babylonians executed Zedekiah's sons in front of him, then blinded him and took him to Babylon in chains. The soldiers entered Jerusalem, burned the temple and the palace, broke down the walls and carried off everything of value that remained. Many of the surviving inhabitants were marched off to Babylon, joining those taken earlier. A few poor farmers were left behind to tend the vineyards and fields so the land would not lie completely empty. The city that had stood as the capital for nearly 4 centuries, the place where David had established his throne and Solomon had built the temple, now lay in ruins. Smoke rose from the burned buildings for days. The spring still flowed at the base of the ridge, but there were few people left to draw its water. The walls that had protected generation after generation were reduced to piles of stone. The temple platform stood empty, except for scattered debris. The long story of the United Kingdom and the first centuries of the divided realm had reached its lowest point. Yet even in the smoke and silence, the memory of Jerusalem and the hope of return remained alive among the exiles by the rivers far to the east. The Babylonian conquest and exile, the soldiers who had entered the broken city moved methodically through the streets. They rounded up the remaining officials, priests, craftsmen, and anyone who might organize resistance or hold useful skills. Among those taken were the young King Jehoiachin from the earlier deportation, and, after the final siege, many more who had survived the months of hunger and fighting. The march eastward began almost at once. Families walked in columns guarded by Babylonian troops, carrying what little they could salvage from their homes. The route followed established roads through the Jordan Valley, across the desert fringes, and finally along the Euphrates River. It covered nearly 1,000 miles and took several weeks. Dust rose from thousands of feet, and the exiles passed through landscapes that grew flatter and more fertile as they neared the great river systems of Mesopotamia. Upon reaching Babylonian territory, the groups were assigned to settlements prepared for them. One large community formed near a canal called the Chebar, not far from the city of Nippur. Others went to places whose names appear in later records as Al-Yahudu, or City of Judah, and similar villages. The Babylonians did not treat them as ordinary slaves chained to royal estates. Instead, they followed a system used for many deported groups. Land was allotted in exchange for service. Families received plots to farm, mainly growing barley, dates, and vegetables. They paid taxes in produce or silver and could be called on for labour projects or military support when needed. Some exiles quickly adapted and began trading in local markets, while a few even rose to minor administrative roles within the empire's bureaucracy. Cuneiform tablets discovered centuries later list Judean names alongside Babylonian ones in business contracts, showing loans, sales of goods, and partnerships that formed over time. The prophet Jeremiah, who had remained behind in the land, sent a letter to the first wave of exiles back in 597 BCE. He advised them to build houses, plant gardens, marry and raise families, and seek the welfare of the city where they now lived. His words encouraged a practical outlook rather than constant mourning. Many followed that guidance. Houses of mud brick went up along the canals, gardens produced food, and children were born who had never seen Jerusalem. Yet the older generation kept the memory alive. They gathered in small groups to recite the traditions they had brought with them, to sing the songs of David, and to observe the Sabbath as a day set apart from the work of the fields. Circumcision continued as the mark of their identity, and stories of the Exodus and the kings were told to the young so that the connection to their past would not fade. In one settlement by the Chebar Canal, the prophet Ezekiel lived among the exiles. He had been taken in the first group, and worked as a priest before his calling. There, beside the water, he experienced visions that he described in careful detail to those who came to listen. His words spoke of the glory of the Lord leaving the temple before its destruction and of a future time when a new spirit would revive the people. Ezekiel's presence gave structure to the community's religious life. Without a temple or altar, they turned to prayer and the study of the writings they had carried. Scribes copied scrolls of law and history, preserving them in the new environment. Public fasts and confessions became more common, and the practice of gathering for instruction gradually took shape. These meetings would later influence the way communities worshipped in many places far from Jerusalem. Meanwhile, a small remnant had been left in the ruined land. The Babylonians appointed a governor named Gedaliah, a member of a Judean family known for its loyalty. He set up his administration at Mizpah, a town a few miles north of the destroyed city. Gedaliah urged the remaining farmers and shepherds to settle down, tend the vineyards and fields, and live quietly under Babylonian oversight. For a short time, the countryside began to show signs of recovery. Olive trees were pruned, grain was sown, and life resumed a modest rhythm. Yet resentment simmered among some who had escaped the deportations. A man named Ishmael, from a royal family, plotted against the governor. He struck at Mizpah during a feast, killed Gedaliah and the Babylonian officials with him, and fled toward Egypt with a group of followers. The survivors, fearing Babylonian retaliation, decided to leave the land altogether. They made their way south to Egypt, taking the elderly prophet Jeremiah with them against his advice. That small band settled in places like Tahpanhes and Memphis, where they continued their customs but remained a separate group. Back in Babylonia, the larger exile communities grew more established. The exiles were scattered in villages along the canals, but they stayed in touch through messengers and shared news from home. Letters and occasional visits kept the hope of return alive. Some families prospered enough to own small herds or engage in crafts such as weaving or pottery. Babylonian records showed Judeans appearing as witnesses in contracts and even lending money at interest, a sign that they had become part of the local economy. Yet they did not forget who they were. The rivers and canals of Babylonia reminded them constantly of the waters they had left behind. One group of musicians, asked to sing the songs of Zion for their captors, hung their harps on the willow trees and refused. The moment passed into memory as a quiet act of defiance that strengthened their sense of belonging to something larger than their present circumstances. Religious life adapted to the new setting. Without the temple, the daily sacrifices could not continue, so the focus shifted to the study of the law and to prayer. The Sabbath took on greater importance as a public marker of identity, observed even by those who worked alongside Babylonian neighbours. Circumcision remained the covenant sign for every male child. Families taught their children the stories of Abraham, Moses, and David, using the scrolls that had been saved. Prophets and teachers among them emphasized that the disaster had come because of past failures to follow the covenant, yet they also spoke of a future restoration. This period of reflection produced a deeper sense of the universal nature of their God, who could be worshipped anywhere, not only on the hill in Jerusalem. The exile lasted for the lifetimes of many who had walked the long road from Judah. Children born in Babylonia grew up speaking Aramaic as their daily language, while learning Hebrew for the sacred texts. They heard stories of the city's former glory and of the spring that once flowed at its base. Some of the exiles, especially the descendants of the priests and scribes, became the keepers of the traditions that would later help shape the community's return. The years brought a certain stability. The land-for-service system allowed families to plan ahead, to repair their houses, and to celebrate births and marriages with the old customs. Yet underneath the practical routines ran a current of longing. When the exiles sat by the canals in the evening, the sound of the water sometimes reminded them of the Gihon spring they had left behind, and the distance felt both physical and emotional. By the middle of the 6th century BCE, the Babylonian Empire itself faced new pressures. Internal rebellions and the rise of Persian power to the east began to change the political landscape. The exiles heard rumours of these shifts through traders and messengers. They continued their daily work, ploughing fields, mending tools, teaching their children while quietly hoping that the promises of the prophets would one day come true. The community had not dissolved into the surrounding population. Instead, it had found ways to maintain its distinct practices and its shared memory of Jerusalem. The forced journey that began in the smoke of the burned city had led to a new chapter in which the people learned to live as a minority while preserving the core of their identity. The small number who had stayed in the land after the first deportations and then after the final destruction tried to make a life among the ruins. They harvested whatever vines and fields had survived, but the absence of so many skilled hands made the work harder. Without strong leadership after Gedaliah's death, the region became even quieter, a backwater under distant Babylonian governors. News from the exile communities filtered back occasionally, carried by brave travellers or merchants. These reports kept a thin thread of connection alive between the two groups. The exiles, for their part, sent what encouragement they could, urging those left behind to hold on. In the Babylonian settlements, the passing years brought marriages between the first generation and their children born there. The population of the Judean villages slowly increased. Some families accumulated modest wealth through careful farming and trade. Babylonian legal documents record Judeans buying and selling land, slaves, and goods within the rules of the empire. This integration was not total assimilation. It was a practical arrangement that allowed them to survive and even contribute to the economy around them. One curious detail that later tablets reveal is how some exiles ended up managing date orchards or small businesses alongside their neighbours, turning the land allotted for service into a source of steady income. It was a far cry from the grand courts of Jerusalem, yet it showed a resilience that surprised even the Babylonians who had brought them there. As the decades passed, the exiles developed new ways to mark time and identity. They observed the festivals as best they could, Passover with whatever lamb or goat they could obtain, the Feast of Weeks with the first fruits of their gardens, and tabernacles under makeshift shelters. These observances, stripped of the temple's grandeur, became more personal and communal. The absence of a central sanctuary forced them to rely on memory and on the growing collection of writings. Scribes worked carefully to preserve and organize the laws, histories, and prophecies. This effort laid groundwork for later compilations that would help the people understand their past and their future. The story of the Babylonian conquest and exile is one of disruption, followed by quiet adaptation. The city on the ridge lay empty and broken, its temple reduced to rubble and its walls scattered stones. Yet the people carried its meaning with them across the desert and into the canals of a foreign land. They farmed, traded, raised families, and remembered. The rivers of Babylon became the backdrop for both sorrow and determination. The journey that began with the fall of the walls ended, for that generation, in villages where a new form of community life took shape, one that would prove strong enough to endure until the political winds shifted once again and the possibility of return appeared on the horizon. Return, under Persian rule, and the second temple news of a change in the great powers reached the settlements along the canals in Babylonia around 539 BCE. The Persian king Cyrus had defeated the Babylonian forces and entered the city of Babylon itself without a long siege. One of his first acts as the new ruler of the empire was to issue a decree that allowed the peoples who had been deported by the Babylonians to return to their homelands and restore their temples. For the Judean communities, this meant the possibility of going back to the land they still called home. Cyrus's proclamation was read aloud in the villages, and copies were circulated so that families could discuss what it might mean for them. Not everyone chose to leave. Many had built lives in the new land, with houses, fields, and businesses that were now familiar. Some stayed behind, forming the beginning of a lasting community in Babylonia. Others, perhaps around 50,000 in the main group, decided to make the journey westward. The first return happened under the leadership of a man named Sheshbazzar, described as a prince of Judah. He carried with him the vessels from the original temple that the Babylonians had taken away decades earlier. the caravan set out with wagons, loaded with supplies, tools, and the sacred items. The route followed much of the same path the exiles had taken years before, but now in the opposite direction. It passed through desert stretches and along established roads maintained by the Persian administration. When the group finally reached the hills of Judah, they found the land quieter than they remembered. Jerusalem lay mostly in ruins, with piles of stone where the walls and temple had once stood. The spring at the base of the ridge still flowed, but few people lived nearby. The returning group camped in the surrounding area and began to clear spaces for settlement. A larger and more organised return followed a few years later, led by Zerubbabel, a grandson of the last king of Judah, and Joshua, who served as high priest. They arrived with more families, priests, Levites, and servants. The Persian authorities appointed Zerubbabel as governor of the province, now called Yehud, which was a small district within the larger satrapy. The first priority was to rebuild an altar on the old temple site, so that sacrifices could begin again according to the traditions. In the 7th month after their arrival, the people gathered at the ruined platform and set up the altar. They offered burnt offerings there even before any walls or buildings were restored. The sound of the trumpets and the smell of the sacrifices marked the resumption of regular worship after nearly 50 years of interruption. Work on the temple foundation started soon afterward. The people brought cedar logs from Lebanon, arranged through permission from the Persian officials, and paid local workers to help with the labour. When the foundation was laid, the priests and Levites led a ceremony of praise. Some of the older people who had seen the first temple wept because the new beginning looked so modest compared with what they remembered, while the younger ones shouted for joy. The mixed sounds of weeping and rejoicing could be heard far across the ridge. Progress was slow. The province was poor, the population small, and the work required constant effort just to clear the rubble and gather materials. Local groups from the surrounding districts, including people who had remained in the land and others who had moved in during the exile years, offered to help, but were turned away because they did not share the same strict practices. This refusal created tension and led to complaints sent to the Persian court. For about 15 years the building work stalled, while opposition continued, and the people focused on their own houses and fields. Then, new encouragement came through the prophets Haggai and Zechariah. Haggai spoke directly to Zerubbabel and Joshua, reminding them that the time had come to finish the temple. He pointed out that the people lived in panelled houses while the Lord's house remained in ruins. His words stirred the leaders and the people to action again. Zechariah added messages of hope, speaking of a future where Jerusalem would be a city without walls because the Lord himself would be its protection. Work resumed in earnest. The Persian king Darius, who had succeeded Cyrus, confirmed the original decree and even provided funds from the royal treasury to support the effort. No further interference came from the local officials after that. The temple was completed and dedicated in 515 BCE, exactly 70 years after the destruction of the first one according to the traditional count. The ceremony included sacrifices and the installation of the priests and Levites in their divisions. The people celebrated the Passover shortly afterward with great joy. The second temple was smaller and simpler than Solomon's had been. It lacked the golden furnishings and the Ark of the Covenant, which had disappeared during the earlier destruction. Yet, it stood as the central place of worship once more. Priests offered the daily morning and evening sacrifices, and the people began to bring their tithes and offerings again. The rhythm of religious life that had been preserved in the exile settlements now took root on the hill in Jerusalem. Life in the province during these decades remained modest. Most families lived in small villages scattered across the hills rather than inside the ruined city itself. They farmed terraced fields, grew grain, olives and grapes, and kept small flocks of sheep and goats. The governor and a small group of officials stayed in Jerusalem, but the population there was limited. The temple drew people for the festivals, when families travelled from their villages to participate in the sacrifices and shared meals. The returning exiles brought with them the customs and the writings they had developed in Babylonia, including a stronger emphasis on the study of the law and the observance of the Sabbath. These practices helped give the community a clear identity even under Persian rule. About 70 years after the temple dedication, another important figure arrived from the Persian court. Nehemiah served as cupbearer to King Artaxerxes I. When he heard reports that the walls of Jerusalem were still broken and the gates burned, he asked the king for permission to travel there and rebuild them. Artaxerxes granted the request, provided letters for safe passage, and appointed Nehemiah as governor. Nehemiah arrived around 444 BCE and spent the first few nights quietly inspecting the ruined walls by moonlight. He then called the leaders and the people together and told them of the king's support. The response was immediate. Families and groups took responsibility for different sections of the wall. Priests worked beside merchants, and even some women helped with the labour. Opposition came quickly from neighbouring officials who did not want to see Jerusalem strengthened. They mocked the workers and later plotted to attack or lure Nehemiah into a trap. Nehemiah organised the builders so that half worked while the other half stood guard with spears and shields. The work continued from dawn until the stars came out. In only 52 days the walls were completed and the gates set in place. The people gathered inside the city for a dedication ceremony. Priests and Levites formed two great processions that walked in opposite directions along the top of the new walls, singing and giving thanks. The sound of their voices and the music of cymbals and trumpets filled the air as they met at the temple. Nehemiah also turned his attention to the social and religious life inside the city. He encouraged more families to move into Jerusalem so that the capital would have a stronger population. Lots were cast to decide who would relocate, and 1 in 10 were chosen. He addressed problems of debt and slavery among the poorer families by cancelling debts and returning land that had been pledged. On a public occasion, he had the Book of the Law read aloud from a wooden platform in the square before the Watergate. The scribe Ezra stood beside him and explained the meaning of what was read. The people listened for hours, then wept as they understood how far their practices had drifted. They renewed their commitment to follow the law, including the proper observance of the Sabbath and the support of the temple through regular tithes. Ezra, a priest and scribe who had arrived a few years earlier with another group of exiles, continued this work of reform. He gathered the people and addressed the issue of marriages with women from neighbouring peoples. Many such unions had taken place, and Ezra called for them to be dissolved to preserve the community's distinct identity. The assembly agreed after careful discussion. These reforms, though difficult, helped shape a more unified way of life centered on the temple and the law. The priests and Levites received their portions so they could devote themselves fully to their duties without needing other work. The temple services became more regular, and the festivals drew larger crowds from the province and beyond. During this period, the province of Yehud remained small and peaceful under Persian oversight. The satrap in Damascus or farther away handled larger matters, while the local governor managed daily affairs. Taxes went to the empire, but the people were free to practice their religion and rebuild their communities. Jerusalem itself was still not large. Its new walls enclosed a smaller area than in the days of the kings, and many spaces inside remained open or used for gardens. Yet the city had regained its role as the religious and administrative centre. The spring continued to supply water, now carried up to the temple area for the rituals. Markets near the gates offered basic goods, grain, oil, wine, and simple crafts. Life moved at the pace of the agricultural seasons and the temple calendar. One practical detail from those years gives a glimpse into daily routines. In the time around Nehemiah's governorship, the people who lived in and around Jerusalem followed patterns that had become settled after the return. The governor and his officials formed the small upper group, handling Persian correspondence and local justice. Priests and Levites, supported by tithes, focused on the temple and teaching. Most families belonged to the farming class, working the terraced hillsides from early morning until dusk. Men and women wore simple tunics of wool or linen, often with a cloak for cooler evenings, and sandals made of leather. Food consisted mainly of barley or wheat bread, lentils, onions, olives, cheese from goat's milk, and occasional meat or fish when available. On festival days, richer dishes appeared, including roasted lamb and sweetened cakes. Houses were modest, built of local stone with flat roofs where families could sit in the evening. These patterns reflected a community that had learned to live simply after the losses of exile and the hard work of rebuilding. The decades under Persian rule brought a quiet stability to the ridge that had seen so much. Destruction. The Second Temple stood as the visible sign of continuity with the past, while the new walls gave a sense of security. The people who had returned, and those who joined them later, developed ways of worship and community life that no longer depended on a powerful king or a large army. Instead, they relied on the law, the priesthood, and shared memory. Jerusalem had become the center of a smaller but more focused province, where the routines of sacrifice, teaching, and seasonal work shaped the days. The long journey from the canals of Babylonia had led to this restored but modest city, where the next chapters of its story would unfold under changing rulers from distant capitals, Hellenistic influence, and the Maccabean revolt. The Persian period drew to a close in 332 BCE, when Alexander the Great marched through. The region, after defeating the Persian army at Issus, Judea offered no serious resistance. Alexander's forces passed by the city on their way to Egypt, and the high priest and elders met him outside the walls to confirm the existing arrangements. After Alexander's sudden death in 323 BCE, his vast empire split among his generals. For the next century, Judea fell under the control of the Ptolemies, who ruled from Alexandria in Egypt. The change in overlords brought new administrative habits and a steady flow of Greek settlers and merchants into the coastal plain and inland towns. Greek became the language of government and international trade, though Aramaic and Hebrew continued in everyday village life and in the temple courts. The Ptolemies left the internal affairs of the province largely in the hands of the high priest and a council of elders. Taxes were collected efficiently, and the temple received a regular subsidy from the royal treasury. Families in the villages continued their seasonal work, while Jerusalem slowly grew as a centre where priests, scribes, and traders gathered. Some younger members of the priestly families began to adopt Greek names and customs, finding them useful for business dealings with officials from Alexandria. A few wealthy families sent sons to study in the great city on the Nile, returning with ideas about philosophy, athletics, and city planning. These influences remained limited at first, but they planted seeds that would later cause friction. In 198 BCE, the balance shifted when the Seleucid king Antiochus III defeated the Ptolemies at the Battle of Panium and took control of the region. The new rulers from Antioch in Syria were more ambitious about spreading Greek culture across their territories. They encouraged the building of gymnasiums and theatres in the larger towns, and they offered tax breaks to cities that adopted Greek constitutions. In Jerusalem, a group of leading citizens, including the high priest Jason, petitioned the Seleucid king for permission to transform the city into a Greek-style polis. They received approval and quickly set about constructing a gymnasium near the Temple Mount. Young men from the better families exercised there, wearing the short Greek tunic and practicing wrestling and discus throwing. Some even underwent a surgical procedure to reverse the mark of circumcision so they could participate without embarrassment. The high priest Jason himself sent a delegation to the games at Tyre, carrying money for sacrifices to the Greek god Heracles. Though the delegates quietly redirected the funds to more acceptable causes, not everyone welcomed these changes. Many in the countryside and among the older priests saw the gymnasium and the new fashions as a threat to the traditions preserved since the return from exile. The temple services continued as before, but the presence of Greek officials at festivals and the use of Greek names in official documents created a growing divide. A rival high priest named Menelaus, from a different priestly line, outbid Jason for the office and promised even greater loyalty to Seleucid policies. The resulting power struggle inside Jerusalem turned violent. Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who had come to the throne in 175 BCE, intervened personally. He viewed the unrest as a sign of disloyalty at a time when he needed money and stability for his wars against Egypt and the rising power of Rome. In 169 BCE, Antiochus returned from a campaign in Egypt and entered Jerusalem with his troops. He stripped the temple of its golden vessels and treasures to pay his soldiers. 2 years later, after rumours of his death sparked a revolt in the city, he sent a general with orders to impose strict control. The Seleucid forces attacked on the Sabbath, when many defenders refused to fight, and established a citadel inside the city called the Acra. Soldiers were stationed there permanently, and foreign settlers moved in. Then, in December 167 BCE, Antiochus issued decrees that banned the practice of Jewish law. Circumcision was forbidden, copies of the sacred writings were to be burned, and the temple was to be dedicated to the Greek god Zeus Olympios. An altar was built on the old sacrifice platform, and on the 25th of Kislev a pig was offered there, the ultimate insult to those who kept the dietary laws. The event became known among the people as the Abomination of Desolation, a phrase that captured both the horror and the deliberate insult of the act. The enforcement of these orders reached even the smaller villages. In the town of Modi'in, about 15 miles northwest of Jerusalem, a Greek official arrived to supervise a sacrifice on a new pagan altar. An elderly priest named Mattathias refused to comply. When another Jew stepped forward to perform the act in his place, Mattathias killed both the man and the official, then fled to the hills with his 5 sons. That single refusal in a dusty marketplace became the spark for open revolt. Mattathias and his followers, soon joined by others who shared their determination, began a campaign of guerrilla warfare. They attacked pagan altars in neighbouring villages, circumcised boys by force when necessary, and destroyed symbols of Greek worship. Mattathias died within a year, but his 3rd son Judas took command. Judas earned the nickname Maccabeus, meaning the hammer, for the swift and decisive blows his small bands delivered against larger Seleucid detachments. The fighting was uneven at first. The rebels operated from caves and mountain passes, striking at night and melting away before reinforcements arrived. They avoided pitched battles until their numbers and experience grew. In 165 BCE, Judas led a force against a much larger Seleucid army at Emmaus. He divided his men into 4 groups, attacked from different directions at dawn, and routed the enemy before it could form ranks. The victory gave the rebels captured weapons and supplies. A second major clash at Beth Zur the following year forced the Seleucids to withdraw from much of the Judean countryside. By late 164 BCE, Judas and his men were able to approach Jerusalem itself. The Acra citadel remained in enemy hands, but the temple area had been abandoned. The rebels entered the courts, tore down the desecrated altar, built a new one of unhewn stone, and relit the menorah with ritually pure oil. The 8-day dedication ceremony that followed became the origin of the festival of Hanukkah, observed each year afterward with lights and simple meals. The war did not end with the temple's recovery. The Seleucids, distracted by internal dynastic quarrels and wars on other fronts, sent several more expeditions. Judas met them with a mixture of diplomacy and force. He formed a cautious alliance with Rome, sending envoys who explained the Jewish cause and received a friendly but non-binding reply. In 160 BCE, Judas fell in battle at Al-Aqsa against a superior force led by the general Bacchides. His brother Jonathan assumed leadership. Jonathan proved an able diplomat as well as a soldier. He played the competing claimants to the Seleucid throne against one another, switching sides at the right moment and eventually receiving official recognition as high priest and governor of Judea. Under Jonathan, the territory expanded slightly, and the army became more professional. Yet the Acra citadel still stood inside Jerusalem, a constant reminder that full independence had not yet arrived. Jonathan's brother Simon succeeded him in 143 BCE, after Jonathan was captured and executed in a Seleucid trap. Simon moved more cautiously but with greater success. He besieged the Acra and starved its garrison into surrender. In 141 BCE, the last Seleucid soldiers marched out and the walls of the citadel were torn down. For the first time since the Babylonian conquest more than 4 centuries earlier, Judea was free of foreign troops and could mint its own coins. Simon was confirmed as high priest, military commander, and leader of the people by a great assembly held in Jerusalem. The decree granting him these titles was inscribed on bronze tablets and displayed publicly. The brief period of Hasmonean independence had begun. The years of fighting had reshaped the community. Many families from the countryside had moved into Jerusalem for safety during the wars, and the city began to expand again within the old walls. The temple resumed its full schedule of sacrifices, festivals, and offerings. Priests and Levites returned to their rotations, and scribes copied fresh scrolls to replace those destroyed in the persecution. The rebels had attracted support from groups who valued strict observance of the law, including early members of what would later become the Pharisees and the Essenes. At the same time, some of the Hellenizing families who had supported the Seleucids lost their influence or left the region. The victories also brought a new confidence to the people. They had seen that determined resistance against a larger empire could succeed when combined with knowledge of the terrain and unity of purpose. Simon ruled until 134 BCE, when he and 2 of his sons were assassinated by his son-in-law during a banquet at the fortress of Doc. His surviving son, John Hyrcanus, inherited a stable realm. The Hasmonean family now combined the offices of high priest and ruler, something that had not occurred under the Davidic kings. John Hyrcanus expanded the borders further, conquering territory in Samaria and Idumea. He destroyed the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim and forced the Idumeans to adopt Jewish practices. These actions reflected the new emphasis on religious uniformity that had grown out of the revolt. Yet the independence was fragile. Rome watched the Eastern Mediterranean with increasing interest, and the Seleucid kingdom, though weakened, still posed occasional threats. The Hasmoneans maintained a standing army and built fortresses along key routes to protect the roads leading to Jerusalem. Inside the city, life settled into a new rhythm. Markets near the gates sold goods brought by caravans from the north and south. Farmers delivered produce for the temple offerings and for the growing population. The spring at the foot of the ridge supplied water as it had for centuries, now channeled to public pools and the temple courts. The gymnasium built in the earlier period fell into disuse or was repurposed, a quiet sign that the cultural pendulum had swung back toward older ways. Yet Greek remained useful for trade and diplomacy, and some families continued to use Greek names alongside their Hebrew ones. The revolt had not erased all Hellenistic influence, it had simply placed it under local control. The Maccabean struggle left a lasting mark on how the people understood their own history. They had reclaimed the temple through their own efforts rather than waiting for a foreign king's permission. The festival of Hanukkah reminded each generation of the lights kindled in the dark days of persecution. Stories of Mattathias's stand in Modi'in and Judas's nighttime marches circulated among the villages, passed from parents to children around evening fires. The Hasmonean rulers, though not of the ancient Davidic line, were accepted as legitimate because they had restored the proper worship and defended the law. Their brief era of self-rule gave the city and the surrounding province a taste of autonomy that would be remembered long after larger empires returned to assert their dominance. Roman, arrival, and Herod's transformations. The brief period of Hasmonean self-rule ended amid growing internal divisions within the priestly family. 2 rival claimants to the high priesthood, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, turned to the expanding Roman Republic for support. In 63 BCE, the Roman general, Pompey the Great, arrived with his legions and intervened in the dispute. After a 3-month siege, his troops entered Jerusalem, reportedly walking into the temple courts while the priests continued their rituals. Pompey left the high priest in place, but placed the region under Roman oversight as part of the province of Syria. The city lost its full independence, and tribute payments began flowing to Rome. For the next decades, Roman governors managed larger affairs while the Hasmonean line retained some local authority. Civil wars in Rome brought further changes. After Pompey's defeat by Julius Caesar, the region shifted again. Then, in the power struggles that followed Caesar's death, a new figure emerged. Herod, son of an Idumean official who had served the Hasmoneans, had already proven himself as governor of Galilee by suppressing bandits and maintaining order. He cultivated ties with Roman leaders including Mark Antony. When the Parthians invaded and installed a Hasmonean rival, Herod fled to Rome. In 40 BCE, the Roman Senate declared him king of Judea, and 3 years later, with Roman military help, he captured Jerusalem and began his effective rule. Herod married Mariamne, a granddaughter of the Hasmonean high priest, which gave him a link to the old royal line and helped quiet some opposition among the people. Herod ruled as a client king, loyal to Rome while exercising considerable freedom in local matters. He eliminated remaining Hasmonean threats, including executing his young brother-in-law, the high priest, and later his own wife, Mariamne, on suspicion of plotting. To secure his throne, he built a network of fortresses across the country, including Masada by the Dead Sea and Herodium near Bethlehem. In Jerusalem itself, he strengthened the defences and constructed a new royal palace on the western hill, protected by 3 massive towers named after his friends and himself. The Antonia fortress rose at the northwest corner of the temple platform, allowing soldiers to watch over the sacred area. These projects demonstrated both his need for security and his desire to present Jerusalem as a modern capital worthy of Roman approval. The most ambitious undertaking was the complete rebuilding and enlargement of the temple. Herod began the work around 20 BCE and continued it throughout his reign. He expanded the platform by constructing massive retaining walls on the south, east and west sides, using enormous stones, some weighing over 50 tons. The western wall, later known as the Western Wall, formed part of this support system. The enlarged esplanade could hold thousands of worshippers, and the temple itself was rebuilt in fine white stone with gold overlays that caught the sunlight. The project employed thousands of workers and took decades to finish. The main sanctuary was completed in a year and a half, but the outer courts and porticos continued long after Herod's death. Pilgrims who arrived for festivals saw a structure far grander than the one they had known, yet it followed the traditional layout with an outer court for Gentiles, inner courts for Jews, and the Holy of Holies at the centre. Herod also introduced other buildings that reflected the Hellenistic and Roman tastes of the age. An amphitheatre and a theatre appeared in the city, where games and performances took place on special occasions. Aqueducts brought water from distant springs to supply the growing population and the temple's ritual needs. Markets and warehouses expanded to handle the increased trade that came with stability. The city walls were repaired and extended, enclosing a larger area than in previous centuries. These changes turned Jerusalem into a prosperous regional centre, visited by merchants from across the eastern Mediterranean and by Jewish pilgrims from distant communities. Under Herod's rule and the broader Roman oversight, the population of Jerusalem increased steadily. People moved in from the countryside for work on the building projects or to serve in the temple. Roman soldiers maintained order from the Antonia fortress, while Herod's own guards patrolled the streets. Taxes flowed both to the king and to Rome, collected through local officials. The Sanhedrin, a council of elders and priests, continued to handle religious and some civil matters inside the city, giving a measure of continuity with older practices. Herod himself visited the temple regularly and supported the priesthood with gifts. Yet he also appointed high priests from families he trusted rather than allowing the office to remain hereditary in the old lines. During the decades of Herod's reign, the daily patterns of life in and around Jerusalem reflected a society organized by social position and occupation. At the upper level stood the king's court and the small circle of nobles and officials who managed administration and collected revenue. They lived in the new palace complex, wore finer versions of the common tunic, made from imported linen or wool dyed in bright colours, and ate meals that included roasted meats, fresh fish from the coast, imported fruits, and wine stored in large jars. Below them came the priestly families and Levites attached to the temple. They received portions of the offerings and tithes, lived in quarters near the sacred precincts, and followed strict rules of purity. Their clothing consisted of simple white linen garments for service, with embroidered sashes for higher ranks, and their food emphasized bread, olive oil, vegetables, and occasional meat from the sacrifices. The merchant and artisan class occupied the middle ground, running shops along the main streets and trading goods such as pottery, cloth, spices, and tools. They dressed in practical wool tunics belted at the waist, with cloaks for cooler weather, and their meals centered on barley bread, lentils, onions, cheese from goat milk, and dried fish, supplemented by whatever fresh produce the markets offered. At the lower end were the labourers, farmers who brought goods to the city gates, and servants who worked in households or on building sites. Their clothing was made of coarser wool or undyed linen, often patched from long use, and their daily food was simpler, still flatbread, seasonal vegetables, olives, and water or thin wine. Families across all groups rose early for work, observed the Sabbath as a day of rest, and gathered for the major festivals when the city filled with visitors and the temple courts echoed with prayers and music. Water from the expanded aqueducts and the ancient spring was carried in jars or channeled to public pools, while houses ranged from multi-room stone buildings for the wealthy to single-room mud brick dwellings for the poorer families. The stability Herod provided allowed trade to flourish. Caravans arrived from the east with spices and silk, while ships docked at the new harbour he built at Caesarea on the coast brought goods from Italy and Greece. Money circulated in the form of coins stamped with Herod's image or Roman symbols, though the temple tax was paid in the older shekels that avoided graven images. Scribes and teachers gathered in the temple porticos to discuss the law and instruct younger students. Physicians and herbalists practiced near the markets, and families celebrated births, marriages, and harvests according to long-standing customs. The presence of Roman officials and soldiers was a constant reminder of foreign rule, yet daily routines continued much as they had for generations, shaped by the agricultural calendar and the temple schedule. Herod died in 4 BCE after a long illness. His kingdom was divided among 3 of his sons. Archelaus received Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, but proved so unpopular that the Romans removed him in 6 CE and placed the region under direct rule by procurators sent from Rome. Jerusalem itself remained the religious centre, with the temple still drawing pilgrims and the Sanhedrin handling local affairs. The city's expanded layout and grand buildings continued to serve the population, but the political atmosphere grew more tense under the new governors. One procurator, Pontius Pilate, who served from 26 to 36 CE, provoked protests by bringing military standards bearing the emperor's image into the city and by using temple funds for an aqueduct project. These incidents showed how the balance Herod had maintained between Roman demands and local sensitivities could easily be upset. Throughout the early decades of the 1st century, the population continued to grow. New neighbourhoods spread beyond the old walls, and the temple platform became the focal point for both worship and occasional public gatherings. Roman troops remained stationed in the Antonia fortress, ready to intervene if unrest developed during the crowded festival seasons. The spring at the base of the ridge and the aqueducts supplied water for the increased numbers, while markets near the gates handled the daily exchange of goods. The social divisions that had existed under Herod persisted, with each group contributing to the city's economy and religious life in its own way. The client-king system had given way to direct Roman administration, yet the physical city Herod had transformed stood as a lasting monument to his reign. The arrival of Roman power and the transformations carried out by Herod marked a new chapter for the ridge and its inhabitants. The city that had once been a modest capital of a small kingdom now functioned as an important provincial centre within a vast empire. Its walls enclosed grand public spaces, its temple served as the religious heart for Jews across the known world, and its streets reflected the mixture of local traditions and foreign influences that characterized the age. The heavy hand of Roman oversight was felt in taxes, troop movements, and occasional displays of authority, but the everyday work of farming, trading, and worship continued without interruption. The spring still flowed, the festivals still drew crowds, and the people adapted to the realities of life under distant rulers while preserving the customs that defined their community. The life of Jesus and the first Jewish revolt after Herod's death and the removal of his son, Archelaus. The Romans placed Judea under direct administration by procurators appointed from Rome. The first of these, Coponius, arrived in 6 CE and immediately conducted a census to organize taxation more efficiently. The new system required every household to register its property and income, a process that caused resentment among many who saw it as an intrusion by foreign authority. The high priest and the Sanhedrin retained authority over religious matters and some local disputes, but major decisions and the use of armed force rested with the procurator, who usually resided in Caesarea on the coast and came to Jerusalem mainly during the crowded festival seasons to maintain order. Pontius Pilate served as procurator from 26 to 36 CE. He introduced several measures that tested local sensitivities. Early in his term, he brought military standards bearing the emperor's image into the city at night, an act that provoked protests because it placed forbidden images inside the holy area. Pilate eventually removed them after large crowds gathered in protest. He also used funds from the temple treasury to construct an aqueduct that brought additional water from a spring several miles away, an improvement that benefited the growing population but angered those who viewed the money as belonging solely to the temple. During his tenure, a teacher from the village of Nazareth in Galilee named Jesus arrived in Jerusalem on several occasions. Jesus had spent most of his public activity in the northern region, speaking in synagogues and open places about the kingdom of God, offering practical guidance on daily conduct, and performing acts of healing that drew crowds from the surrounding countryside. His followers, many of them ordinary fishermen, farmers, and craftsmen, accompanied him and helped spread his message. In Jerusalem, Jesus taught in the temple courts during the Passover festival around the year 30 CE. He addressed the money changers and sellers of sacrificial animals who operated in the outer courtyard, overturning their tables and criticizing the commercial atmosphere that had developed there. The incident drew the attention of the temple authorities, who saw it as a challenge to the established order. A few days later, after sharing a meal with his closest followers, Jesus was arrested in a garden outside the city walls by a group that included temple guards and Roman soldiers. He was brought before the high priest and the Sanhedrin for questioning about his teachings, then handed over to Pilate for judgment on the charge of claiming to be a king, which could be interpreted as rebellion against Roman rule. Pilate questioned him briefly, and finding no clear threat to public order, ordered his crucifixion outside the city, along with 2 others convicted of crimes. The execution took place on a small hill known as Golgotha, and the body was placed in a nearby tomb before the start of the Sabbath. A small group of his followers, including women who had travelled with him from Galilee, remained nearby and later reported that the tomb was found empty on the 3rd day. They began to meet privately in Jerusalem, sharing meals and recounting what they had seen and heard during the time with Jesus. These followers gradually formed the nucleus of a new movement within the Jewish community. Many of them continued to participate in the temple rituals and synagogue gatherings, while also gathering in homes to pray, break bread together, and tell stories of Jesus' life and teachings. One of the early leaders, a fisherman named Peter, spoke publicly in the temple courts during the festival of Pentecost, explaining the events they had witnessed. The group grew steadily, attracting both Jews from Jerusalem and visitors from other regions who had come for the festivals. They shared their possessions so that no one among them lacked basic needs, and they cared for widows and the sick. The temple authorities viewed the movement with suspicion because it seemed to challenge their control, and several of the leaders were arrested and brought before the Sanhedrin. One young member named Stephen was stoned after a public speech that criticized the way the temple had been managed over the centuries. His death prompted a period of scattering, and some of the followers travelled to other towns in Judea and Samaria, where they continued to share the message. The movement spread beyond Jerusalem. Small communities formed in Galilee, Antioch in Syria, and even as far as Rome itself. In these places, the followers, who came to be called Christians, adapted their practices to local conditions while maintaining the central belief that Jesus had been raised and would one day return. They kept the Jewish Sabbath and festivals, but also began to gather on the first day of the week to remember the resurrection. Letters written by leaders such as Paul, a former Pharisee who had once opposed the group but later joined it after a vision on the road to Damascus, circulated among the communities and offered guidance on how to live in the new faith while navigating Roman society. Paul himself visited Jerusalem several times to meet with the original apostles and to bring financial support collected from the newer groups for the poorer members in the city. Meanwhile, the Roman procurators who followed Pilate continued to govern with varying degrees of skill. Some, like Felix and Festus, dealt with local banditry and political disputes while trying to keep the peace during festivals. Others, such as Albinus and Florus, were remembered for corruption and heavy-handed actions that increased resentment. Florus, who took office in 64 CE, seized money from the temple treasury and allowed his soldiers to loot parts of the city after minor disturbances. These incidents added to the long list of grievances that had accumulated since direct Roman rule began. Various Jewish groups responded in different ways. The Sadducees, mainly from the priestly families, worked closely with the Romans to maintain order and protect their position. The Pharisees emphasized careful observance of the law and study in synagogues. The Essenes lived in separate communities, such as the one near the Dead Sea, focusing on purity and waiting for a divine intervention. A more militant group known as the Zealots, or Sicarii, named for the small curved daggers they carried, advocated active resistance and occasionally assassinated Roman officials or Jewish collaborators in crowded streets. Tensions rose sharply in the spring of 66 CE. A dispute in Caesarea over access to a synagogue escalated when Greek residents placed a pagan sacrifice in front of it. Florus responded to complaints by demanding payment from the temple treasury in Jerusalem and allowing his troops to plunder the upper market. When the people protested, the soldiers attacked, killing several thousand. The next day, Florus brought more troops into the city and attempted to seize the Antonia fortress. The crowd fought back, and the Roman garrison was forced to retreat. Moderate leaders, including some members of the priestly families, tried to calm the situation and urged negotiation with the Roman authorities. They sent messages to the procurator and even to the governor of Syria, asking for help to restore order. At the same time, the Zealots and other radicals seized control of key points in the city, including the temple, and began to organize defenses. The revolt spread quickly beyond Jerusalem. In the countryside, bands of fighters attacked Roman outposts and sympathetic towns. The Roman garrison in Jerusalem was overwhelmed, and the soldiers in the Antonia fortress were killed or captured. The high priest and other moderates lost influence as the more militant factions took charge. News of the uprising reached the Roman governor of Syria, Cestius Gallus, who marched south with a large force to restore order. His army reached the outskirts of Jerusalem in the autumn of 66 CE and began to prepare for an assault. The Jewish fighters met them in the narrow passes leading to the city, using their knowledge of the terrain to harass the columns. Gallus eventually withdrew after suffering losses, and his retreat encouraged the rebels to believe they could hold their ground. Inside Jerusalem, the provisional government organized itself under leaders such as Eleazar, son of the high priest, and others from prominent families. They minted coins with inscriptions declaring "Freedom of Zion" and Year One of the Redemption of Israel, symbols of the new authority they claimed. Stores of food and weapons were gathered, and the walls were strengthened in preparation for the expected Roman counterattack. The temple continued to function as the religious center, with daily sacrifices offered as before, but now under the control of the rebel priests. Pilgrims still arrived for the festivals, though travel had become more dangerous. The spring at the base of the ridge supplied water for the defenders, and cisterns inside the city were filled in anticipation of a siege. The revolt had begun as a response to specific grievances against Florus and the procurators, but it quickly took on larger dimensions. Fighters from Galilee and other regions joined the cause, bringing both experience and internal rivalries. Different factions competed for leadership, sometimes clashing among themselves even as they prepared for the Roman response. The events surrounding Jesus and his followers which had started quietly in the early part of the century, had by this time produced communities across the empire that watched the developments in Jerusalem with concern. Some Christians in the city remembered Jesus' warnings about coming troubles and chose to leave before the fighting intensified. The broader Jewish population, however, remained divided between those who hoped for a successful stand against Rome and those who feared the consequences of open rebellion. By the end of 66 CE, the city was firmly in the hands of the rebels, and the surrounding province was largely under their control. The Roman authorities in the region regrouped, and word reached Rome that a larger campaign would be necessary. The stage was set for a prolonged conflict that would test the defences Herod had built and the determination of the people who had reclaimed the city from foreign control. The ridge that had seen so many shifts of power over the centuries now stood at the centre of a new chapter, where the hopes of independence met the reality of Rome's military reach. The daily routines of worship, trade, and family life continued amid the preparations, but the atmosphere had changed. The spring still flowed, the market still operated, and the temple still drew those who could reach it. Yet everyone understood that the coming months would bring decisive changes to the life of the city. Destruction in 70 CE, and the aftermath. In the spring of 67 CE, the Roman Emperor Nero appointed a seasoned general named Vespasian to suppress the revolt in Judea. Vespasian gathered a force of about 60,000 soldiers, including 4 legions and auxiliary troops, and began a systematic campaign in the north. He first secured Galilee, capturing town after town and defeating the rebel commander Josephus at Jotapata. Josephus later surrendered and eventually became a historian who recorded much of what followed. By the end of 67 CE, most of Galilee was under Roman control, and many refugees made their way south toward Jerusalem, swelling the city's population and straining its food supplies. Vespasian then moved through the Jordan Valley and the coastal plain, securing the region around Jericho and cutting off Jerusalem from the east. Internal fighting among the rebel factions in Jerusalem continued even as the Romans tightened their grip on the surrounding countryside. 3 main groups competed for power inside the walls, one led by Eleazar, son of Simon, another by John of Gischala, who had come from Galilee, and a third by Simon bar Giora, who controlled parts of the south. These groups sometimes fought each other in the streets while trying to prepare defences against the expected Roman assault. Vespasian was proclaimed emperor by his troops in July 69 CE while in Egypt. He left his son Titus in command of the Judean campaign and returned to Rome to stabilise the empire after the chaotic year of 4 emperors. Titus arrived before Jerusalem in the spring of 70 CE with 4 legions and additional forces, bringing the total to roughly 80,000 men. The Roman army set up camp on the Mount of Olives and on the hills to the west and north. They began constructing a circumvallation wall around the entire city to prevent supplies or reinforcements from entering and to stop anyone from escaping. The defenders, now united under Simon bar Giora and John of Gischala, after earlier clashes, fought fiercely from the walls. They made several sorties to disrupt the Roman siege works, burning some of the battering rams and killing soldiers, but the Romans rebuilt their engines and pressed forward. The first target was the third wall on the north side, built in the years before the revolt to enclose the newer neighbourhoods. After several weeks of heavy fighting and the use of siege towers and battering rams, the Romans breached this outer line in May 70 CE. They then turned to the second wall, which protected the market area and the lower city. Fierce street fighting followed, with defenders using the narrow alleys and rooftops to their advantage. The Romans captured this wall after several days, only to lose it temporarily when the Jews counterattacked. Titus eventually secured it and pushed toward the first wall and the temple platform. By this point, the city was desperately short of food. The large number of pilgrims who had come for Passover and could not leave, combined with the refugees from the north, created severe famine. People ate whatever they could find, including leather belts and scraps from the streets. Disease spread quickly in the crowded conditions, and bodies were thrown over the walls because there was no space to bury them inside. The Antonia fortress, which overlooked the temple, became the next objective. The Romans built ramps against its walls and fought hand-to-hand with the defenders. After bitter combat, they captured the fortress in early July. From there they could look directly into the temple courts. Titus ordered the construction of new ramps against the temple walls themselves. The defenders fought desperately, using stones, arrows, and even fire to destroy the siege engines. On the 10th of Av, according to the traditional Jewish calendar late August, by the Roman reckoning the Romans finally broke through. Fighting spilled into the outer courts. Some defenders set fire to the porticos to prevent the Romans from using them, but the flames spread to the main sanctuary. Titus reportedly tried to stop the destruction of the temple itself, but the fire had taken hold. The wooden beams and furnishings burned fiercely, and the stone walls cracked from the intense heat. By the end of the day, the Second Temple lay in ruins, its gold fittings melted and its sacred vessels carried off by the soldiers. The upper city, where many of the wealthier residents lived, held out for another month. The Romans built new ramps and breached its walls in early September. Street-by-street fighting continued until the last pockets of resistance were overcome. Titus ordered the systematic destruction of the city. The temple platform was cleared, the walls were torn down except for parts of the western retaining wall, and a few towers left as monuments to the Roman victory. Most of the buildings were levelled, and the area was ploughed over in some sections to symbolize complete defeat. Thousands of inhabitants were killed during the final fighting or in the aftermath. Many more were taken prisoner. Some were sent to work in mines or as slaves across the empire. Others were reserved for the triumphal procession in Rome. Titus celebrated his victory with games in Caesarea and other cities, where thousands of Jewish captives were killed in gladiatorial contests or by wild animals. The triumphal arch built in Rome a few years later still stands, showing Roman soldiers carrying the menorah, the table of showbread, and other temple treasures in the victory parade. The sacred items were placed in the Temple of Peace in Rome. The province was reorganized. Jerusalem itself became a ruined site, with only a small Roman garrison stationed among the debris. A legion, the 10th Fretensis, established its camp on the southwest hill. The name of the city was kept, but its status changed dramatically. Jews were forbidden from living in the immediate area of the ruins, though some returned quietly over time. The annual temple tax that had once supported the sanctuary in Jerusalem was redirected to the Temple of Jupiter in Rome, a humiliating reminder of the defeat. In the years immediately after 70 CE, the surviving Jewish communities adjusted to the new reality. Many had fled before the final siege or had been scattered during the earlier fighting. Some made their way to Galilee, where villages like Sepphoris and Tiberias became centres of learning. Others went to the coastal plain or across the Jordan. The Sanhedrin, which had functioned in Jerusalem, gradually re-established itself in the town of Yavne on the coast, under the leadership of Rabbi Johanan ben Zakkai, who had escaped the city during the siege. There the rabbis continued the work of interpreting the law and adapting religious practice to a world without the temple. Daily sacrifices could no longer be offered, so the focus shifted to prayer, study, and acts of charity as replacements for the old rituals. The Sabbath, circumcision, dietary laws, and festivals took on even greater importance as markers of identity. The festival of Tisha B'Av was instituted to mourn the destruction of both the first and second temples. The Christian communities that had grown from the earlier movement around Jesus also faced changes. Many had left Jerusalem before or during the early stages of the revolt, heeding warnings about coming troubles. They settled in other parts of Judea, in Galilee, or farther away in Syria and Asia Minor. Without the temple as a central reference point, their gatherings in homes and local meeting places became the normal pattern. Letters and accounts written in these years, later collected in what Christians called the New Testament, helped preserve the teachings and stories from the time of Jesus. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple was seen by some as fulfillment of warnings Jesus had given about the consequences of rejecting his message. The two movements, Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity, developed along separate paths in the decades that followed, each finding ways to maintain its traditions in a Roman world. The physical site of Jerusalem remained largely desolate for some time. The 10th Legion used stones from the ruined buildings to construct their camp and roads. Farmers from nearby villages occasionally cultivated plots among the rubble, but the city itself had lost its role as a major population centre. The spring at the base of the ridge still flowed, providing water for the small garrison and any who passed through. Travellers on the main roads could see the broken walls and the levelled temple platform from a distance, a visible reminder of the power of Rome. Over the next decades, a few Jewish families returned quietly to live among the ruins or in the surrounding countryside. They gathered for prayer in whatever spaces remained, and kept the memory of the temple alive through stories and study. The destruction of 70 CE marked the end of the Second Temple period and the beginning of a long era in which the city existed in a much reduced form. The ridge that had been the site of settlements for more than 2,000 years now stood quiet under Roman military watch. The grand structures built by Herod had mostly disappeared, leaving only fragments of walls and foundations. Yet the significance of the place endured in the minds of those who had lost it, and in the traditions they carried with them to other lands. The spring continued its steady flow, the hills kept their terraces for future planting, and the memory of what had stood there shaped the identity of scattered communities for centuries to come. The first Jewish revolt had ended in overwhelming defeat, but the story of the city on the ridge was far from over. Byzantine Christian era, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at the ridge lay largely quiet for nearly 3 centuries after the destruction. A small Roman garrison from the 10th Legion camped among the rubble on the southwest hill, using stones from the fallen walls for their own barracks and roads. The temple platform remained empty except for occasional patrols, and the spring at its base continued to supply water for the handful of soldiers and travellers who passed through. Jewish families were not permitted to settle in the immediate area, though some lived in nearby villages and visited discreetly to remember the site. The city, now renamed Aelia Capitolina by Emperor Hadrian after the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 CE, received a new grid of streets and a temple to Jupiter on the old sacred platform. It functioned as a modest provincial town, far from the importance it once held. The shift began in the early 4th century, when the Emperor Constantine, after his victory at the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE and his gradual acceptance of Christianity, turned his attention to the eastern provinces. In 313 CE, he and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, which granted freedom to all religions and ended the persecution of Christians. Constantine saw the faith as a unifying force for the empire, and he began to support its institutions with imperial funds. His mother, Helena, a devout Christian, travelled to the region in 326 or 327 CE to identify sites connected with the life of Jesus. She arrived in Jerusalem, where local Christian communities had preserved traditions about the location of the crucifixion and burial. Guided by these accounts, and by the memory of older residents, she ordered excavations near the site of a Roman temple to Venus that Hadrian had built over the area. Workers removed the pagan structure and uncovered a rock-cut tomb and the remains of an ancient quarry that matched the descriptions handed down through the generations. Constantine approved the construction of a grand church over the spot. The project, known as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, began around 326 CE, under the direction of Bishop Macarius of Jerusalem. Engineers levelled the ground and built a large basilica with an atrium, a central nave flanked by aisles, and a domed rotunda at the western end that enclosed the tomb itself. Marble columns and fine mosaics decorated the interior, and the tomb was encased in a small shrine called the Aedicule. The church was dedicated in 335 CE, during a council of bishops that Constantine convened in the city. The emperor himself did not attend, but sent representatives and lavish gifts, including gold and silver vessels for the altar. The building quickly became the focal point for Christian worship in the region, replacing the scattered house gatherings that had served the community since the time of the Apostles. Other churches rose in the same period. On the Mount of Olives, east of the city across the Kidron Valley, Constantine ordered the Eleona Church built over the traditional site of Jesus' ascension. A smaller chapel marked the place of his teaching to the disciples. In Bethlehem, a few miles south, the Church of the Nativity was constructed over the cave associated with his birth. These structures, funded by the imperial treasury, used the same style of basilica plan that was becoming standard across the empire. Pilgrims began to arrive in greater numbers once the roads were safer and the faith enjoyed official support. They came from every province, travelling by ship to the ports of Caesarea or Jaffa, and then overland to Jerusalem. Many carried letters of introduction from their local bishops and stayed in hostels established near the churches. The flow of visitors transformed the city's economy and daily life. Innkeepers, guides, and merchants set up businesses to serve the pilgrims, who bought small souvenirs such as oil lamps stamped with Christian symbols or vials of water from the Jordan River. The spring at the base of the ridge supplied fresh water for the growing crowds, and cisterns were cleaned and enlarged to handle the demand. Local Christians, many of them descendants of the earlier community that had survived the revolts, acted as hosts and interpreters. They showed visitors the places mentioned in the Gospels and explained the rituals conducted in the new churches. The Bishop of Jerusalem gained greater prominence within the church hierarchy, and the city's Christian population increased steadily as families moved in to support the pilgrimage trade. Under Constantine's successors, the support continued. His son, Constantius II, and later emperors such as Theodosius I, reinforced the Christian character of the empire. Theodosius made Christianity the official religion in 380 CE and prohibited pagan practices. In Jerusalem, this meant the removal of any remaining Roman temples and the expansion of church properties. Monasteries appeared on the surrounding hills, where monks and nuns lived in simple cells and devoted their time to prayer, copying manuscripts and caring for the poor. One of the most influential figures of the period was Cyril, Bishop of Jerusalem in the mid-4th century, who delivered a series of instructional lectures to new converts in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. His teachings helped standardize the order of services and emphasized the importance of the holy sites for understanding the faith. By the 5th and 6th centuries, Jerusalem had become one of the 3 great pilgrimage centers of the Christian world. Alongside Rome and Constantinople, emperors and wealthy patrons continued to add to the city's sacred buildings. Empress Eudocia, wife of Theodosius II, lived in Jerusalem for several years after 438 CE and sponsored the construction of a new wall that enclosed a larger area on the south and east. She also funded churches and hospitals for the growing number of pilgrims, many of whom arrived ill or exhausted from the journey. The city's population reached perhaps 20,000 or more during peak festival seasons, with visitors sleeping in courtyards or temporary shelters when the hostels filled. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre served as the central hub, where processions moved between the basilica and the rotunda on major feast days. Services included readings from the Gospels at the very spots where the events had occurred, giving worshippers a sense of direct connection to the past. The Byzantine administration treated Jerusalem as an important provincial capital within the Diocese of the East. Governors resided in the city or nearby, and maintained order with a modest force of troops. Taxes were collected in the usual Roman manner, but the imperial government also sent subsidies for the churches and for the care of pilgrims. Trade routes brought goods from Egypt, Syria, and the Mediterranean ports to supply the needs of both residents and visitors. Artisans in the city produced fine glassware, pottery, and textiles decorated with Christian motifs. Scribes copied biblical texts and theological works in the monasteries, preserving knowledge that would later influence the wider church. The spring and the aqueducts built centuries earlier continued to provide reliable water, now channeled to public fountains near the churches for the convenience of pilgrims. Life in the city followed a rhythm shaped by the Christian calendar. The week centered on Sunday services in the Holy Sepulchre, and the year revolved around the major feasts: Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and the exaltation of the cross. During Easter week, the streets filled with processions carrying crosses and singing hymns as they moved from the Mount of Olives to the church. Pilgrims from distant lands, including Gauls, Britons, and even Ethiopians, joined the local Christians in these observances. Accounts written by visitors, such as the Spanish nun Egeria, who travelled there around 380 CE, describe the careful order of the services, the lighting of lamps at dusk, and the sense of reverence that filled the spaces. These records give a clear picture of how the city had become a living centre of faith rather than a place of political power. The Byzantine period also saw the development of a distinct Christian art and architecture in Jerusalem. Mosaics on church floors depicted scenes from the Gospels and local wildlife, while the walls featured painted frescoes of saints and biblical figures. Relics associated with the life of Jesus and the early martyrs were housed in special chapels, drawing further visitors. The city's bishops participated in the great church councils that defined Christian doctrine, travelling to Constantinople or Nicaea when called. Their presence helped integrate Jerusalem into the larger imperial church structure. Monasteries in the Judean desert, a short distance away, attracted men and women seeking a life of solitude and prayer, and many of these communities maintained close ties with the churches in the city. By the early 7th century, the Byzantine Empire faced increasing pressure from the east. Persian forces under King Khosrow II invaded the region in 614 CE and captured Jerusalem after a short siege. They damaged several churches, including the Holy Sepulchre, and carried off the relic of the true cross that Helena had identified. The Emperor Heraclius later recovered the city in 628 CE and restored the cross in a grand ceremony. Repairs to the damaged buildings began, but the effort was interrupted by new developments farther south. Arab armies, united under the banner of Islam, had begun to move northward after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 CE. They defeated Byzantine forces at the Battle of Yarmouk in 636 CE and turned toward Jerusalem. The city's Christian leaders negotiated terms of surrender with the Caliph Umar in 638 CE. The agreement allowed the inhabitants to keep their churches and practice their faith in exchange for a poll tax. Umar entered the city peacefully and, according to tradition, refused to pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre so that it would remain a Christian place of worship. He chose a site on the temple platform for Muslim prayer, a decision that would shape the city's future. The Byzantine era, which had lasted more than 3 centuries, came to an end with this transition. The churches continued to function, and pilgrims still arrived, though in smaller numbers under the new administration. The spring flowed as steadily as ever, and the walls built by Eudocia still enclosed the city. The ridge that had seen the rise and fall of temples and kingdoms now stood under a different rule. Yet the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the network of Christian sites remained as enduring landmarks of the period when Jerusalem had served as a beacon for believers from across the known world. The transformation from a ruined garrison town to a thriving Christian pilgrimage centre had been gradual and supported by imperial resources. Each church, each procession, and each visiting group had added a layer to the city's new identity. The daily routines of residents and the seasonal flow of pilgrims created a stable pattern that endured even as political control changed hands. The Byzantine chapter closed with the city intact in its religious function, ready for the next phase of its long history. Islamic conquest and the dome of the rock the Byzantine period in the city ended with a quiet transition rather than a long siege. In 636 CE, the Arab armies, united under the leadership of Caliph Umar, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad 4 years earlier, had already defeated the main Byzantine forces at the Battle of Yarmouk. They moved northward through Syria and approached Jerusalem. The Christian patriarch Sophronius, who governed the city on behalf of the emperor, negotiated terms of surrender to avoid destruction. In 638 CE, Umar himself arrived at the gates with a small escort. He accepted the keys to the city and entered on foot, dressed in simple garments to emphasize that the conquest was not for personal glory. The agreement he signed allowed the Christian inhabitants to keep their churches, continue their worship, and live under their own religious leaders in exchange for a poll tax paid by non-Muslims. No forced conversions took place, and the existing buildings remained untouched. Umar chose an open space on the old temple platform for the first Muslim prayers, a spot that had stood empty since the Roman destruction centuries before. This decision marked the beginning of Jerusalem's role as a holy site for the new faith. The early Muslim administration treated the city as part of the province of Filastin, with its capital first at Ramla and later shifting focus back to Jerusalem for its religious importance. Arab settlers moved into the region gradually, living alongside the existing Christian and Jewish populations. The spring at the base of the ridge continued to supply water for all groups, and the old aqueducts were repaired to meet the needs of the growing community. Daily life settled into a pattern where each religious group managed its own affairs while sharing the same streets and markets. Christians still gathered in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for their services, and a small Jewish community was permitted to return and pray near the western wall of the temple platform. Muslim prayer began in a simple wooden structure built on the platform, later replaced by more permanent buildings as the administration stabilized. Under the Umayyad caliphs, who ruled from Damascus, the city received more direct attention. Caliph Abd al-Malik, who came to power in 685 CE, decided to construct a major shrine on the temple platform to affirm the Islamic connection to the site. Work began around 688 CE and finished in 691 CE. The building, known as the Dome of the Rock, rose on the exact spot where Umar had prayed. Engineers used the same platform that Herod had enlarged centuries earlier, and they covered the dome with a gilded copper roof that reflected the sun across the city. The interior featured intricate mosaics with geometric patterns and Quranic verses, avoiding any images of living beings in line with the new faith's emphasis on the oneness of God. The structure was not a mosque for regular congregational prayer, but a commemorative shrine marking the place from which, according to Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad had ascended to heaven during his night journey. This event gave Jerusalem its third name in Muslim tradition, Al-Quds, or the Holy, and placed it alongside Mecca and Medina as one of the three most sacred cities in Islam. Nearby, another mosque, called Al-Aqsa, was developed on the southern end of the platform. It served as the main place for Friday prayers and could hold large gatherings. Both structures were built with the labour of local craftsmen and materials that included columns from earlier Roman and Byzantine buildings. The caliphs provided funds from the treasury, and the projects employed many residents who had previously worked on church repairs. The presence of these new buildings changed the skyline of the city. From the surrounding hills, the Golden Dome became the most visible landmark, replacing the earlier profile of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as the dominant feature. Pilgrims from the Muslim world began to visit, following routes that connected the holy cities, and they prayed in the open courtyard of the platform before entering the Dome of the Rock. The Umayyad period lasted until 750 CE, when the Abbasid caliphs moved the capital of the empire to Baghdad. Jerusalem remained important, but received less direct funding. Repairs to the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa continued when earthquakes damaged them, and local governors oversaw the maintenance. The Christian and Jewish communities continued their own traditions without interference. Monks in the desert, monasteries near the city, copied manuscripts and maintained ties with the churches inside the walls. Jewish scholars in Jerusalem and nearby towns worked on biblical texts and commentaries, preserving their learning in the same way they had since the time of Yavne. The markets near the gate sold goods brought by caravans from Damascus and Egypt, and the spring supplied water that was carried in jars to homes across the different quarters. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the city had developed distinct neighbourhoods that reflected the religious groups living there. Muslims settled mainly around the temple platform, Christians near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the other churches, and Jews in a smaller area near the western wall of the platform. Each group followed its own calendar of festivals and daily prayers, yet they shared the same public spaces and economic life. Artisans produced pottery, glass and textiles that were traded across the region, and scribes in all three communities copied books in Arabic, Greek and Hebrew. The caliphs in Baghdad sent occasional governors who collected taxes and kept order, but the day-to-day administration was handled by local officials from the different faiths. Water from the ancient spring and the repaired aqueducts remained the main supply, now channeled to public fountains near the mosques and churches for the convenience of residents and visitors. The Fatimid caliphs from Egypt took control of the region in 969 CE and brought a new period of stability mixed with occasional tensions. They restored several buildings after earthquakes and added gates to the city walls. One of the most notable was the Gate of the Chain, which led directly to the temple platform. Under their rule, the population grew again, as traders and scholars arrived from North Africa and other parts of the Muslim world. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa were maintained with care, and their golden dome and silver dome became symbols recognized by travelers from distant lands. Christian pilgrims continued to visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, though in smaller numbers than during the Byzantine centuries, and Jewish scholars from Babylonia and other centres came to study in Jerusalem's academies. The city functioned as a meeting place where ideas from different traditions could be discussed in the markets and study circles without disrupting the overall peace. In 1009 CE, the Fatimid Caliph Al-Hakim ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and several other Christian buildings. The order was carried out, and the church was left in ruins for a time. This event caused hardship for the Christian community, but after Al-Hakim's death, his successor allowed rebuilding. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine IX Monomachos contributed funds, and the church was partially restored by 1048 CE with a smaller dome over the rotunda. The incident remained an exception rather than the rule. Most of the time, the three communities lived alongside one another, with the practical arrangements established under Umar. The spring continued its steady flow, unaffected by the changes in rulers, and the city's walls, rebuilt and strengthened over the centuries, protected the inhabitants from occasional raids by Bedouin tribes. By the late 11th century, the Muslim world faced new pressures from the east and the west. The Seljuk Turks had taken much of the region, and the Fatimids held only parts of Palestine. In 1071 CE, the Seljuks captured Jerusalem, but their control was short-lived. The Fatimids regained the city in 1098 CE, just as reports reached the region of a large Christian army approaching from Europe. The stage was set for the next major shift, but for the 4.5 centuries since Umar's entry, the city had functioned as a shared holy place. The Dome of the Rock stood as the central Islamic monument, its design influencing mosque architecture across the empire. Al-Aqsa served as a place of assembly and prayer, and the platform itself became known as the Haram al-Sharif, or Noble Sanctuary. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained the heart of Christian worship, and the small Jewish community kept its traditions alive near the Western Wall. The Islamic conquest had introduced a third faith to the ridge, without erasing the earlier layers. Each group maintained its sacred spaces, while the city as a whole continued to serve as a centre of learning and trade. The daily routines of prayer, study, and commerce followed the rhythms of the different calendars, yet the spring and the markets brought everyone together in practical ways. Scribes in the mosques copied the Quran, monks in the churches copied the Gospels, and Jewish scholars studied the Torah in their study houses. Caravans arrived with spices, cloth, and books, and the gates opened each morning to farmers bringing produce from the surrounding hills. The city had grown used to multiple languages and customs, and the administration under the caliphs allowed this diversity to continue as long as taxes were paid and order was kept. The period from the 7th to the 11th centuries saw Jerusalem transform once again into a place recognized by the wider world. Muslim geographers described it in their travel books, Christian pilgrims wrote accounts of their journeys, and Jewish letters from the Cairo Geniza mention visits to the city for study and prayer. The Dome of the Rock, with its inscriptions quoting the Quran, proclaimed the Islamic view of the site as the place of Abraham's sacrifice and Muhammad's ascension. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, even after its partial destruction and rebuilding, continued to draw believers who followed the path of the cross. The Western Wall became a quiet place of Jewish prayer, where people gathered to remember the earlier temples. All three traditions looked to the same ridge and found different meanings in its history. The transition to Islamic rule had been orderly, and the building of the new shrines had given the city a fresh architectural identity without removing the older ones. The spring still bubbled at the base of the ridge, supplying water as it had for the Jebusites, the kings of Judah, the Romans, the Byzantines, and now the Muslims. The walls enclosed a city that was smaller than in Herod's time but more integrated across faiths. Daily life moved at the pace of the seasons and the call to prayer, the ringing of church bells and the study sessions in the synagogues. The ridge had become a meeting point for three faiths, each adding its layer to the long story of the place, while the underlying rock and the steady spring remained unchanged. Crusader kingdom, Mamluk rule, and Ottoman takeover. The reports of a large Christian army moving toward the city reached Jerusalem in the summer of 1099. The First Crusade, launched by Pope Urban II 4 years earlier, had already crossed much of Europe and Asia Minor. The Fatimid rulers who held the city at the time prepared for defence, but the Crusader forces, numbering around 20,000 after months of marching and fighting, arrived at the walls in June. They set up camps on the north and west sides and began constructing siege towers and ladders from local timber. The defenders inside, a mix of Fatimid troops and local residents, resisted for several weeks. On July 15, the Crusaders broke through the northern wall near the present-day Herod's Gate area. Fighting spread quickly through the streets. The Crusader leaders, including Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse, took control of the city within a day. Many of the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were killed in the initial chaos, while others fled or were taken captive. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the other Christian sites were secured and placed under Latin clergy. The Crusaders established the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem as a feudal state modelled on European kingdoms. Godfrey became the first ruler, though he took the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre rather than king. His brother Baldwin succeeded him in 1100 and was crowned king in Bethlehem. The kingdom stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the Jordan River and from the Galilee in the north to the Negev in the south. Jerusalem served as the capital, and the Crusaders repaired the walls and strengthened the gates. They converted the Dome of the Rock into a church called the Templum Domini and turned Al-Aqsa Mosque into a palace for the king and later the headquarters of the Knights Templar. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was enlarged with new chapels and a bell tower. Hospitals run by the Knights Hospitaller cared for pilgrims and the sick, drawing support from across Europe. Life in the kingdom blended European customs with local practices. Knights and nobles from France, England and Italy received land grants and built castles along the borders. Merchants from the Italian city-states of Venice, Genoa and Pisa set up trading quarters in the coastal ports and inside Jerusalem itself. They brought goods from Europe and shipped eastern spices, silk and sugar back to the west. The local population, including Christians who had lived under Muslim rule, Muslims who remained, and a small Jewish community, continued farming the surrounding hills and supplying the city markets. The spring at the base of the ridge supplied water for the increased number of residents and visitors. Pilgrims arrived by the thousands each year, travelling in armed convoys to protect against raids. The kingdom maintained a fragile peace through treaties with neighbouring Muslim rulers, but border conflicts were common. The Crusader hold lasted until 1187. By then, the Muslim leader Saladin had united the forces of Egypt and Syria. He defeated the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin in July of that year and marched on Jerusalem. After a short siege, the city surrendered on October 2. Saladin allowed the Christian population to leave after paying a ransom, and he permitted the churches to remain open under new agreements. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa were restored for Muslim use. Saladin's Ayyubid dynasty controlled the city for the next decades. Later crusades, including the third led by Richard the Lionheart in 1191, came close but never recaptured Jerusalem. A treaty in 1229 between Emperor Frederick II and the Ayyubid Sultan Al-Kamil gave the Crusaders temporary control of the city without the walls, but it lasted only a few years before Muslim forces retook it in 1244. The Mamluk sultans from Egypt took firm control after defeating the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260 and then ending the last Crusader strongholds on the coast. Under Mamluk rule, which lasted from 1260 to 1517, Jerusalem became a provincial city within a large empire centered in Cairo. The Mamluks repaired the city walls and gates and restored several mosques and madrasas on the Haram al-Sharif. They built new religious schools and hostels for pilgrims from across the Muslim world. The Dome of the Rock received fresh mosaics and marble work after earthquake damage. Christian and Jewish communities continued to live in their quarters, paying the poll tax and maintaining their holy sites. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained the centre for Christian worship, though repairs were limited and access was regulated. Jewish scholars and merchants settled in greater numbers, and the area near the Western Wall became a regular place of prayer. Daily routines in the city followed the patterns established over centuries. Farmers from nearby villages brought olives, grain, and vegetables to the markets near the gates. Artisans worked in small shops producing glass, pottery, and textiles. Water from the spring and the aqueducts was carried to public fountains. The Mamluk governors, appointed from Cairo, collected taxes and kept order with a small garrison. Pilgrims from Europe, Ethiopia, and the Muslim East still visited, though travel remained difficult. The city was smaller than in Crusader times, with open spaces inside the walls used for gardens and livestock. Earthquakes in 1303 and 1341 caused damage, but each time the Mamluks organised repairs to the major shrines. The long Mamluk period ended when the Ottoman Turks, under Sultan Selim I, defeated the Mamluk army at the Battle of Marj Dabik in 1516 and moved south into Palestine. In 1517, the Ottomans entered Jerusalem without resistance. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled from 1520 to 1566, paid special attention to the city. He rebuilt the walls in their present form between 1537 and 1541, using stone from local quarries and creating the 7 gates that still stand today. The walls enclosed roughly the same area as in earlier centuries and gave the city a stronger defensive appearance. Suleiman also restored the citadel near Jaffa Gate and improved the water supply with new fountains and channels from the spring. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa received minor repairs, and the Ottomans appointed a local governor to manage affairs while allowing the different religious communities a large degree of self-rule. Under Ottoman administration, the city settled into a long period of calm. The empire stretched from North Africa to the Persian Gulf, and Jerusalem was a minor provincial centre within the Eyalet of Damascus. Taxes were collected regularly, but the population was left to manage its own religious and community affairs. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived in separate quarters, each with its own courts and leaders. The spring continued to provide water, and markets near the gates handled daily trade in food, cloth, and household goods. Jewish immigration increased in the 16th century, especially after the expulsion from Spain in 1492, and the community built new synagogues. Christian pilgrims from Orthodox and Catholic traditions arrived in steady numbers, supported by agreements between the Ottoman sultans and European powers. The Franciscans maintained a presence at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and cared for pilgrims. The 17th and 18th centuries brought occasional local troubles, such as raids by Bedouin tribes or disputes between the Christian denominations over rights at the holy sites. The Ottomans generally kept order and allowed the status quo to continue. In 1700, a group of Ashkenazi Jews from Poland tried to establish a settlement but faced financial difficulties. The city walls, built by Suleiman, protected the inhabitants from most external threats. Inside, life moved at the pace of the agricultural seasons and the religious calendars of the three faiths. Call to prayer from the minarets mixed with church bells and the sound of study in the synagogues. Caravans brought goods from Damascus and Cairo, and the markets remained busy each morning. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire faced growing pressure from European powers. The city began to see more visitors and consuls from Britain, France, and Russia, who reported on conditions and sometimes intervened in disputes over holy places. The population grew slowly, reaching around 10,000 by the 1840s. New neighbourhoods started to appear outside the walls as families sought more space. The spring and the old aqueducts still supplied water, but larger cisterns were dug to meet demand. The long Ottoman period, which lasted until the end of World War I, gave Jerusalem 4 centuries of relative stability. The walls Suleiman built defined the Old City, and the Dome of the Rock, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Western Wall continued to serve their respective communities without major interruption. The shifting control from Crusader knights to Mamluk sultans to Ottoman governors had brought periods of conflict followed by long stretches of practical coexistence. Each ruling power had repaired the walls, maintained the water supply, and allowed the religious sites to function. The ridge that had seen so many changes over the centuries now stood within a stable imperial framework. Daily life for most residents involved work in the fields or markets, prayer at the familiar shrines, and the quiet routine of family and community. The spring flowed steadily at the base of the city, unchanged by the succession of armies and administrators. The city had become a place where multiple traditions coexisted under distant rule, setting the stage for the transformations that would arrive with the 20th century. 19th and early 20th century changes under Ottoman and British rule. The long calm of Ottoman rule began to shift noticeably in the middle of the 19th century. European powers increased their interest in the region, sending consuls to Jerusalem and pressing the Ottoman government for better protection of Christian holy sites. In 1852, the Sultan issued a decree known as the status quo that fixed the rights of the different Christian denominations inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and other shared places. This arrangement prevented open conflict, but required careful negotiations whenever repairs were needed. At the same time, the first neighbourhoods outside the old city walls started to appear. In 1860, a group of wealthy Jewish families built Mishkenot Shah Nanim on the western slope, the first modern settlement beyond the walls. Other quarters followed: the German colony, the Greek colony, and new Arab neighbourhoods to the north and south. Families moved out to escape the crowded conditions inside the old city and to build larger houses with gardens. Travel to the city became easier after 1869, when a carriage road opened between Jaffa and Jerusalem. Tourists and pilgrims arrived in greater numbers, many of them from Europe and America. Hotels opened near Jaffa Gate, and guides offered tours of the holy sites. The population grew from about 10,000 inches, the 1840s, to around 30,000 by the turn of the century. Muslims still formed the largest group, followed by Jews and Christians. The spring at the base of the ridge and the old aqueducts continued to supply water, but new cisterns and a small pumping system helped meet the increased demand. Markets inside the walls stayed busy each morning, while new shops opened along the growing streets outside. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 brought changes in Ottoman administration. Greater freedom of the press and assembly allowed local newspapers to appear, and political discussion increased. During the First World War, the city came under direct military control. The Ottoman Fourth Army used Jerusalem as a base, and supplies were requisitioned from the local population. The war years brought hardship, food shortages, disease, and the cutting of many olive trees for fuel. In December 1917, British forces under General Edmund Allenby advanced from the south. After a brief campaign, the Ottoman governor surrendered the city on December 9 without a fight inside the walls. Allenby entered on foot through Jaffa Gate, showing respect for the holy places. The British issued a proclamation promising to protect the rights of all religious communities and to maintain the status quo at the holy sites. The British established military administration first, then civil government under the Mandate for Palestine, granted by the League of Nations in 1920. Jerusalem became the administrative capital. New government offices opened in the former Russian compound and other buildings outside the walls. The population continued to grow, reaching about 60,000 by the late 1920s. Jewish immigration increased, especially after the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which expressed British support for a Jewish national home. New neighbourhoods expanded rapidly to the west and north: Rehavia, Talpiot, and Beit Hakerem. Arab neighbourhoods also grew, including Katamon and Baka. The British improved roads, installed street lighting, and built a modern water supply system that brought water from distant springs through pipelines. Daily life in the city reflected the mixture of old and new. Inside the old walls, the narrow streets and covered markets kept their traditional character, with shops selling spices, cloth, copperware, and fresh bread. Outside, wider streets allowed cars and buses to move between the new quarters. Schools multiplied, including government schools, mission schools, and private Jewish and Arab institutions. The Hebrew University opened on Mount Scopus in 1925, giving the city its first modern institution of higher learning. Hospitals and clinics served all communities. The British police and courts handled major crimes, while religious courts continued to manage personal matters for Muslims, Jews, and Christians. Tensions between the communities rose during the Mandate years. In 1929, riots broke out after disputes at the Western Wall, resulting in deaths in Jerusalem and other cities. Further violence occurred in 1936 during the Arab Revolt, when strikes and attacks targeted British forces and Jewish settlements. The British responded with curfews, searches, and the building of security fences in some areas. Yet daily routines continued for most residents. Farmers from surrounding villages still brought produce to the markets each morning. The call to prayer from the minarets, church bells, and the sound of study in yeshivas mixed as before. Water from the new pipelines reached more houses, though the ancient spring remained a backup source. The old city stayed a place of pilgrimage for all three faiths, with visitors moving carefully through the shared spaces. The Second World War brought another period of relative calm to the city. British forces used Palestine as a base, and the population benefited from the economic activity. After the war, pressure for a political solution increased. In 1947, the United Nations proposed partitioning Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem placed under international administration. The plan was accepted by Jewish leaders but rejected by Arab leaders. When the British Mandate ended on the 14th of May 1948, fighting broke out immediately. Jewish forces secured the western parts of the city, while Arab forces, supported by troops from neighbouring countries, held the Old City and the eastern districts. A ceasefire in 1949 left the city divided. The Old City and East Jerusalem came under Jordanian control, while West Jerusalem became part of the new State of Israel. A no-man's land of barbed wire and minefields separated the two sides, and the Mandelbaum Gate served as the only crossing point for limited official traffic. During the 19 years of division, the two halves developed separately. In West Jerusalem, the Israeli government built new government buildings, including the Knesset and the Supreme Court, and expanded neighbourhoods to the west and south. The Hebrew University moved its main campus to Givat Ram after Mount Scopus became an enclave. In East Jerusalem, the Jordanian authorities repaired the old city walls and maintained the holy sites. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa continued to serve Muslim worshippers, while the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Western Wall remained accessible only to those who could cross the border. Families divided by the ceasefire line could sometimes meet at the Mandelbaum Gate under supervision. The spring still flowed at the base of the ridge, now on the Jordanian side, and water systems on both sides were developed independently. The divided city existed in a state of tense calm until June 1967. During the Six-Day War, Israeli forces captured East Jerusalem and the Old City after heavy fighting around the walls. The barriers were removed, and the two halves were reunited under Israeli administration. The government immediately extended Israeli law to East Jerusalem and began restoring access to the holy sites for all faiths. The Western Wall was cleared of the buildings that had stood in front of it, creating the open plaza that exists today. The old city markets reopened, and residents from both sides began to move more freely, though tensions remained high. The 19th and early 20th centuries had brought the city out of its long provincial quiet. New neighbourhoods, improved water supplies, schools and hospitals changed the physical appearance and daily routines of its people. The British Mandate period accelerated these changes while also deepening the political divisions that would shape the decades after 1948. The spring that had served every ruler since the Jebusites continued its steady flow, now feeding modern pipelines on both sides of the former divide. The walls built by Suleiman still enclosed the old city, standing as a reminder of the long layers of history beneath the modern streets. The city that had once been a small hilltop settlement had become a place where ancient claims and modern national movements met each day. Division, reunification, and modern tensions, the fighting that broke out in 1948 lasted through the spring and summer. When the British Mandate ended on May 14, Jewish forces had already secured most of the western districts, while Arab forces held the Old City and the eastern areas. A ceasefire in 1949 left the city divided along a line that ran through the centre. Barbed wire, concrete barriers, and minefields formed a no-man's land that separated the two sides. The Old City and East Jerusalem came under Jordanian control. West Jerusalem became part of the new State of Israel. The Mandelbaum Gate served as the only official crossing point, used mainly by diplomats, clergy, and a few families with special permits. Families split by the line could sometimes meet there under supervision, exchanging news and small gifts before returning to their separate lives. In the western part, the Israeli government set up its institutions. New apartment blocks rose in areas such as Rehavia and Kiryat Moshe. The Knesset building opened in 1966 on a hill overlooking the city, and the Supreme Court followed later. The Hebrew University relocated its main campus to Givat Ram after Mount Scopus became an isolated enclave. Hospitals, schools and libraries expanded to serve the growing population, which reached about 150,000 by the mid-1960s. Daily life followed a steady pattern. People worked in government offices, small factories or shops along Jaffa Road. Buses ran on regular schedules, and markets sold fresh produce brought in from nearby farms. Water came through new pipelines, though the ancient spring still supplied some neighbourhoods on the eastern side. On the Jordanian side, the old city remained much as it had been for centuries. The walls built by Suleiman enclosed the narrow streets and covered markets. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa continued to serve Muslim worshippers, while the Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained the centre for Christian services. The Western Wall stood accessible only to those who could cross the border. Jordanian authorities repaired buildings damaged during the earlier fighting, and maintained the holy sites according to the long-standing arrangements. The population there numbered around 60,000, supported by tourism and small-scale trade. Farmers from surrounding villages still brought olives, vegetables and sheep to the Damascus Gate market each morning. The spring at the base of the ridge supplied water for the eastern districts, carried in the same way it had been for generations. The division lasted 19 years. During that time, the two halves developed separately, with little contact between residents. Occasional incidents at the border reminded everyone of the fragile situation, but daily routines continued without major interruption. Children attended schools on their own side, families celebrated holidays in their own quarters, and the call to prayer, church bells, and the sound of study mixed with the noise of traffic on the western streets. The city that had once been a single community now functioned as two distinct places sharing the same ridge. In June 1967, the situation changed rapidly. During the Six-Day War, Israeli forces moved into East Jerusalem and the Old City after several days of fighting around the walls. By June 7, the barriers came down, and the two halves were reunited under a single administration. The government extended Israeli law to the eastern districts and declared the city the capital. Access to the holy sites was restored for all faiths. The western wall was cleared of the small structures that had stood in front of it, creating an open plaza where people could gather for prayer. The old city markets reopened, and residents from both sides began to move more freely through the streets, though underlying tensions remained. In the years that followed, the city expanded further. New neighbourhoods rose to the north, south, and east, including Ramot, Gilo, and French Hill. Roads connected the growing areas, and public transport improved. The population increased steadily as families arrived from other parts of the country and from abroad. Government offices and cultural institutions spread across the unified city. The Hebrew University returned to its original Mount Scopus campus. Hospitals and universities served people from all backgrounds. At the same time, the different communities maintained their separate quarters and religious institutions. The Muslim population continued to worship on the Haram al-Sharif, Christians at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and other sites, and Jews at the Western Wall and numerous synagogues. The spring still flowed at the base of the ridge, now feeding a modern water system that reached nearly every neighbourhood. The city grew into a busy modern centre, while keeping its ancient character inside the walls. Tourists arrived in large numbers each year, walking the same streets that had seen so many earlier visitors. Markets sold spices, textiles, and souvenirs to people from every continent. Schools and universities taught students from diverse backgrounds, and hospitals provided care across community lines. Yet political disagreements persisted. Negotiations over the city's status continued in various forums, with each side presenting its claims. Residents went about their daily work, driving to offices, shopping in the markets, attending classes, or praying at the holy places, while the larger questions remained unresolved. By the early years of the 21st century, the population approached 900,000. New light rail lines connected the old city with the newer districts. Modern buildings stood alongside restored Ottoman and British-era structures. The old walls, still intact, enclosed the historic core where the three faiths maintained their shrines. The spring continued its quiet flow, supplying water as it had done for more than 3,000 years. Families lived in apartments or houses across the expanded city, sending children to school and gathering for meals at the end of the day. The rhythm of life included the morning call to prayer, the sound of church bells, and the quiet murmur of study in yeshivas, all blending into the steady noise of traffic and conversation. The story of the city in these decades remained one of shared spaces and separate memories. People from different backgrounds worked together in hospitals, universities, and markets while holding their own traditions. The ridge that had seen early settlements, kings, temples, conquests, and divisions now stood as a single urban area under one administration, yet claimed in different ways by the peoples who lived there. New generations grew up knowing the city as both an ancient holy place and a modern home. The spring at its base kept flowing, the walls kept standing, and the daily routines of work, study, and prayer continued without pause. Through all these changes, the place retained its quiet endurance. The human side of its history appeared in the ordinary moments: families sharing meals, children playing in parks, merchants arranging goods in the markets, and worshippers pausing at the familiar shrines. The city had grown far beyond the small hilltop site of its earliest days, yet the same rock and the same spring anchored it in place. The continuing story reflected the way people adapted to new realities while holding on to what mattered most to them. The ridge remained a meeting point for multiple traditions, each adding its layer to the long record of events, while the underlying landscape stayed steady and unchanged. Everything has changed, and yet the essential feeling remains familiar. Take a slow breath and let the details settle. The story has been told in full, layer by layer, without hurry. You can rest now knowing the account is complete, and the city keeps its place in the quiet flow of time. The lights in the room can stay low, the fan can keep its soft hum, and the night can wrap around you gently. Nothing more needs attention tonight.